My life growing up was far from good. Rather than constant physical abuse, although there was that too, my parents ignored me most of the time. Both had drinking problems. My mom only worked part-time so she could, as she said, be there for her kid, but she really spent the majority of her free time in a bottle or bed. My dad was the main breadwinner, working as a over-the-road truck driver. He was away most of the time, leaving me alone to take care of myself. Our apartment was on the edge of town, surrounded by miles of forest. As long as I can remember, I was entranced by those woods. It wasn't long before I was spending my days exploring them. My love of nature only grew from there. I soon realized neither of my parents were paying attention to my comings and goings, so I began camping out in the woods overnight, here and there just to see if I'd be missed. But as I figured, I wasn't. From there, I began spending weeks at a time camping throughout the vast forest. We all know all good things must end, and one morning, I was caught walking out of the woods by my father. He just arrived back from time on the road. It was early, and he was livid to see his 12-year-old son walk out of the woods at 5 a.m. on a school day. In addition to tanning my hide, I got an earful from them both. This didn't stop me from returning, though. After laying low around home for a week, I waited for my dad to leave and my mom to drink. When I was sure she was asleep, I fled back to my real home. I would slip back early every morning prior to school without anyone noticing. It didn't take long for things to go back to the way they had been before. If I wasn't at school, I was out roaming the woods. I mentioned before I had a series of camps throughout the forest. Early on, I realized I was sharing my getaway with others. Among these interlopers were small groups of homeless people, probably way before I came along. They'd use the woods as a place to camp and drink, away from the prying eyes of the police and public. I made the mistake of staying in the same place too long on one occasion and almost got assaulted because of it. After that run-in, I moved my camps to the other side of the river. Some nights I would lurk in the shadows and watch them destroy themselves with drugs and drink. Many times violence would break out, and this only reinforced my hate for them. I already saw enough of that at home anyway. As the months passed, I moved deeper into the vast forest, always looking for a new place to explore. Summer came, and with it, more homeless. It wasn't long before they had their filthy little camps all over the woods. However, at that point, I was still safe if I stayed on my side. I was the only person who knew where to cross. River or not, my paradise would be taken away from me, once and for all, by these very same people. One hot summer afternoon, I was down on the banks getting water. I'd heard voices off in the distance, so was keeping my eyes peeled. I'd retrieved my water and was returning back to my camp when I heard a group of people arguing on the opposite side. Curious, I hid and watched. There was a raggedy tent set up, and next to it, 3 men and 1 female yelling at one another. They were too far away for me to make out much of what was said. They all looked like they were drunk, swaying around while they argued. I stayed around for about 10 minutes when one of the men hit another over the head with a beer bottle. The man staggered and fell to the ground. I waited for the man on the ground to move, but he didn't. The assailant then picked up a big rock and threw it down on the man while the others just stood by and watched. He did this over and over, about 3 times, until he looked too exhausted to continue. I had to stifle a scream as I watched this horror unfold, and by now was too scared to move. The female then yelled something at the man and slapped him on the chest. He looked unfazed and instead just stared down at the mess he'd just made. After a minute of doing this, the others yelled something again at him, and they all ran away together. I could finally breathe, but still dared not move in case they returned. I stayed hidden for what seemed like hours before I decided they weren't coming back. I expected the man on the ground to get up, but now I know how stupid that was. I got the crazy idea in my head that I needed to get him help. Drunk bum or not, he was still a human, and I ran the entire 3 miles back to our apartment. For some reason, I was happy to see my father was home. I ran in, short of breath, and began yelling for my parents. I noticed them sitting together on the couch and ran up to them. My dad told me to shut up and then asked me what the matter was. I repeated the story of what I had just witnessed in the woods. Rather than getting help, my dad began yelling at me about defying him. My slurring mom soon joined in, and they both commenced to chewing me out a new a-hole. The worst part was when my mother accused me of making up stories to get attention. I denied this, of course, but she wasn't listening. The rest went the way it always did. My dad pulled off his belt and strapped me across until I began crying, and he told me to shut up or give me something to cry about, as usual. It was clear to me the discussion was over. The man wasn't getting helped. After all, I was just a stupid kid. I crawled off to my bedroom and cried myself to sleep, as I had done so many times. My retreats to the woods had ended. I couldn't leave the house without one of my folks, and going outside was out of the question. Not long after that, I was shipped off to live with my dad because I'd become too much for my parents to handle. I expected life to be much as it had before, maybe even worse. After all, there had to be a reason why my mother was so messed up. I kept my guard up for a long time, waiting for the first beating to come. Instead, I would be given a life I could have never dreamed of. Grandpa Mac turned out to be a loving and patient man, the exact opposite of any adult I'd ever met before. The first time he asked me what I liked to do, I was speechless. No one ever cared to ask. I swallowed the knot in my throat and told him of my love for nature. Expecting the usual laughing and mockery, I braced, but instead his face lit up. He spent the next hour telling me of all the great memories he had of camping with his father. I knew then I had become the luckiest kid in the world. As soon as the spring came, we spent every waking moment hiking the woods and parks throughout the country. The knowledge he passed on to me could fill a library full of books. Even though he's gotten too old for us to go out together, I still visit him on a regular basis and share all the amazing adventures I have been through recently. His body may be weak, but his mind is still as strong as ever. I owe that man more than I'll ever be able to repay, and he did everything just because he loved me. It still took me a good 3 or 4 years until I summed up the courage to tell him the story. Also, I expressed the guilt I felt for keeping it to myself all this time. I was unsure of how he'd react. At first, he sat quietly. A moment or two later, he sat up in his chair and hugged me tightly. This confused me, and when he let me go, I asked him what I should do. His advice to me was to contact the police back home and share the story with him. After that, the responsibility was out of my hands, and I didn't need to be guilty ever again. Once I contacted them, I washed my hands of the guilt. Now that I've grown up, I realize my parents were at fault. I did what I should have. If they chose to say nothing, it was on them. I went off to college, and upon my return at Christmas, Mac let me know that the people responsible had been found, although all but the woman were dead. She shared the location of the man's body with detectives. They wanted to thank me for coming forward and helping them to solve this case after all these years. And with that, I moved on, leaving that terrible part of my life behind me. Until recently, with the death of my father, which seems to have dredged up all these old memories, I've not thought of that part of my life in some time. My love for the woods and its creatures has grown into my livelihood. Now I get to travel all over, discovering and preserving the world's wild places before they are gone. Something I could have only dreamed of as a kid, trapped inside a run-down apartment in New Jersey. And without Mac's love, understanding, and teaching, none of it would have ever happened.
This all happened 15 years ago. I was about 19 years old when I was offered a job by my cousin to work for her uncle's glass business. They install giant glass windows into tall buildings and skyscrapers. Not that it's too relevant to the story, but I thought it was worth mentioning. The catch to the job was that I had to temporarily move to Destin, Florida from Tampa. My cousin lived in Russellville, Alabama, and I really wanted to go visit the family there and leave with them together to go back down to Destin. Now, this was my first long-distance road trip, and my very first trip away from my immediate family. Back then, I was driving a green Mercury Sable, a car barely capable of getting groceries back home, but in my invincible youth, I didn't really care about that. I was just so pumped to be spreading my wings and getting out into the real world that the risks didn't really concern me. My mom and dad had tried to get me to plan and pack better, knowing the trip could have its pitfalls. But I mean, it wasn't like the trip was going to last days, and also fast food exists, so I wasn't really stressing out about that. I mean, I'm not stupid. I packed for the trip and I'm going to be staying there for a few months in Destin, but they were really adamant on me bringing food, water, emergency supplies, etc. I declined because it wasn't the 1930s, and of course there's gas stations at every exit, and I had a Razor flip phone. My way of thinking was, what could possibly happen on two busy interstates? It wasn't like I was going to some far-off country with no cell service. Anyways, fast forward to the trip. I'm a Florida boy, so I had no idea Alabama could get so cold, and I also had no idea that the heat was broken in my car. I had never really used it. At first I'm thankful because by the time I reach Alabama, I'm tired as hell, and I had made a lot more stops than I anticipated. I still had a few hours to go, and the cold air was keeping me wide awake. Finally, I pull off the interstate and I start heading through these smaller numbered roads. The roads didn't really have conventional names like in Florida. They were just numbered, which I kinda found odd. After driving on those a bit, I started being sent down gravel roads. This was the days of MapQuest, so I didn't have a GPS guiding me through the just paved roads or rerouting me around roadblocks. I was starting to get really hungry and I thought back to my parents telling me to pack food. I really should have listened. The sketchiest thing with MapQuest was that you just printed out the directions, so you didn't really have a map to fall back on. So going out of your way to find fast food at an exit came with the potential of legitimately getting lost. So I had basically passed a few times to turn off for food because I was tired and I just didn't want to chance it. Instead, however, I was looking for something off the side of the road that I could easily pull in and then back out with no fuss. But more importantly, no risk of getting lost. My prayers were answered a little down the road when I saw a beat-up old country grocery store on my right-hand side. It didn't even have a name. It just said grocery right across the front of the white building. I pulled in because the light shining across the grocery sign was on, but found it odd that most of the lights inside were off. I'm not gonna lie, this gave me the creeps a little, but it didn't stop me from going up to the door. I was really starving and maybe this was a 24-hour place, but I wasn't sure. I saw a shadow move across the back of the long aisles as I approached the glass door and surprisingly opened it with ease. At this point, I was honestly half expecting them to be closed due to the lack of lighting inside, and I was really hoping that the owner would take pity on a tired traveler and let me grab some snacks. I then called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No one answered. I then said something along the lines of, "I saw you when I pulled up, and I was hoping you're still open." Again, no answer. Now, this was really naive of me, but I assumed that maybe the owner was just older or something and maybe he couldn't hear me, or that maybe he was deaf, so I went further back into the store. It honestly didn't really smell that great inside there, and I had hoped that they at least had some chips or something. At least those are sealed. Suddenly a man emerged from the back. "Oh, I'm so sorry, we were just about to close. How can I help you?" he asked with a smile. He clearly made me jump out of my skin at first, but he seemed friendly enough. Not the old man I was picturing before, but actually a much younger guy, maybe in his 30s. "Yeah, I just came up from Florida. It's been a long drive. I was kinda hoping you guys had something to eat for the trip." "Oh, we have plenty. What are you looking for exactly?" he said without taking his eyes off me. The guy had a really weird unblinking stare that just really put me on edge. But what made me the most uncomfortable was his smile. He smiled big, but his eyes never moved. As in, the only way you could tell he was conveying an emotion was by looking at his mouth. The rest of his face stayed the same. Most people, you could tell they're smiling even if their mouth was covered. because you smile with your whole face, but not this guy. Yeah, I just wanted some chips, maybe a Coke. Do you have any Doritos? Of course, he said, walking past me. He locked the door behind me before turning and smiling. I don't want anyone else walking in, he chuckled. Him locking the door was really creepy, but I just shrugged it off because the reasoning was pretty sound, even though it felt off. Follow me, the guy said as he walked towards the back of the store. I was young, but I really should have been smart enough to know that the store owners generally don't give customers a tour of the store, but I had lived a pretty sheltered life. I could feel that something was off, but I didn't want to offend him by asking questions like, "What's that smell?" and other things. We get to the back of the store to where those plastic flaps hang that separate the customer side and the back end. When the man sticks his hand through, parting through the plastic, then saying, "Right this way." Now alarm bells are starting to go off in my head, especially as he starts looking around and past me like someone who's selling drugs and trying to watch out for the police. Back there?" I ask and start to back up a little. That's when I then notice chips right beside me on the aisle. The guy noticed me see the chips and then says, "Yeah, back here. We got all our good stuff in the back. You can come take your pick." By this time, I had found the source of the buzzing. Flies are flying over the meat section, and the dim light that's reflecting off the packaging lets me know that it's been sitting there a while. "I'll just take this if that's all right," I say nervously as I grab a bag off the shelf next to me and then start backing up towards the door. "Trust me, those are no good. I have way better stuff back here." He smiles again, gesturing for me to head back. I fake pat my pockets, then saying, "Oh man, I think I forgot my wallet in my car. I'll be right back." As soon as the words left my lips, I then spun around and did a light jog to the front, increasing with speed as I approach the door. I make it to the door and twist the lock a couple times until I hear the click. I push the door open and turn back to look at where the man is, but he's gone. I jumped into that car and sped the fuck out of that parking lot and didn't stop again until I reached my cousin's house. This happened about 5 years ago now. I had just gotten through a really rough breakup of a codependent relationship, so I was going through a phase of trying to be more independent, self-sufficient, and just generally more okay with being alone. I would go to a lot of movies, restaurants, etc., all by myself. At the time, I was living in Montana where spending time outdoors is a prime recreation. Camping solo seemed like it would be a really good exercise in truly being self-reliant, so I packed a little tent and went to Jerry Johnson Hot Springs. Jerry Johnson is a natural hot springs with a few small, mostly natural pools in the mountains on the border of Montana and Idaho. I'm going to try and keep this as brief as possible, so I won't go on explaining the place. What I will say, however, is that it's truly in the middle of nowhere. From the interstate, it's about a 1/3 mile hike across the bridge and into the woods. And from the interstate, it's about a 45-minute drive in either direction before you reach any kind of civilization in the form of a gas station. There isn't a motel or anything attached to the hot springs like there are with some. It's really just forest land with a few tiny ponds of warm water, and if you ever go, you'll probably be the only person there. There's plenty of daylight, so I decide I'll go soak first and then set up my camp when I'm finished. I make the short hike to find that there's a couple, a man and a woman around their 30s in the main pool, and they look kind of startled to see me. I say a friendly hello from a distance as I then approach. At first, they don't really respond, they just kind of stare at me. Then the guy pipes up. "What are you doing, man?" I then tell him that I'm really confused and I don't know what he means. The man then asks, "Are you the one that's been creeping around the woods and watching us for the last hour or so?" I assured them that I didn't know what they were talking about, and they begin to tell me that there's someone in the woods way off of the trail. Apparently they'd been yelling at him and he just doesn't respond. He'll walk away into the woods for a while and then reappear somewhere else, just watching them. After they've been assured that it isn't me, I get undressed and get into the water. The pupils in their eyes were huge. I'm guessing that they ate some magic mushrooms. I never asked, but it seemed pretty obvious. It's not a big deal. It's basically the perfect setting for something like that, but it makes me think that they might just be having a bad trip. We talked for a while, and first about the creepy guy and then about some other stuff. The mood lightens and they seem pretty relieved not to be alone. I'm a relatively large guy and I guess there's strength in numbers. No more sightings of the creeper. They get out of the pool before me. I'm in the pool all by myself for about 10 minutes before I then hear some shouting in the woods. I decide to cut my soak short just in case someone's in trouble. I get out, dry off quickly, and then get dressed, still mostly wet, when I then hear another shout. I then start quickly hiking. I eventually come across the couple that was shouting off into the woods and saying things like, "Hey man, we have a gun," which they didn't. I ask what's going on and they say that the guy was just ominously standing in the path looking at them way off in the distance. When they started to shout at him, he left the path again and then retreated into the woods. Now he's out of sight. Through all of this happening, they never get a good look at him. We walk back to our cars. We decide that we're all going to camp near each other. There's an official campground, but you have to pay. The guy tells me that he knows about another spot that's relatively flat that would probably work for us. I agree and I decide to follow them. It's not very far. They set up their tent and I set up mine about 100 yards away. I wanted to give them plenty of space to trip or whatever, and I was out there in the first place to camp alone. We were in a dry season on raw forest floor, so neither of us made a campfire. I got all set up and just sat around reading a book, really enjoying all of the nature. The mosquitoes made me retreat into my tent at about 6 p.m., and by 9 I was sound asleep. At about midnight, I was then awoken by the sound of screaming. I grabbed my flashlight and my .22 pistol, put on my shoes but didn't tie them, and then started running toward the other tent. When I arrived, the two were standing outside of the tent with their own flashlights and completely losing it. They said that the guy had been there and that we all needed to get the crap out of there ASAP. They showed me a slice in the wall of their tent that he had made with a knife. They then haphazardly packed all of their stuff in a hurry and we went back to the cars. I only then realized that I hadn't actually grabbed any of my own stuff. I asked if they would go back with me to get it, and they basically just said, "Sorry dude, you're on your own," then got in their car and took off. I then thought about it for a minute. I could come back the next day and get my stuff, but it was over an hour drive in each direction, and I was there now. I did have a gun, but if I shot someone in the woods, even if self-defense, that would be the beginning of another nightmare that would probably last the rest of my life. I made the decision and decided to go back for my stuff. I killed my flashlight and basically went stealth ninja mode back into the trees surrounding the clearing where my tent was. My thought was that if I was really quiet then I could probably hear him, but he couldn't hear me. It took me about 20 minutes to get where my tent was since I was moving so slowly. When I got back to my tent, it was totally untouched. I quickly threw on my backpack, put my flashlight in my mouth, grabbed my tent in its fully assembled state with my sleeping bag still inside of it, and then ran back to the car with a loaded .22 revolver in my hand. I went back to my car, started it, and drove away. What didn't really occur to me until later is that I never actually saw this guy, and to this day, I can't really be sure that there was actually anyone in the woods at all. I really kind of doubt that these people would have sliced their own tent, but at the same time, I kind of doubt that there was actually just a dude hanging out in the wilderness all day and night just to freak these campers out. It's really possible that the two campers were really just messing around with me. If so, they really deserve Oscars for their performance, as they really seem genuinely terrified. I guess I'll never really know though.
The argument started the same way every time. "You'll never catch me dead in a national park. They're full of nothing but fat tourists and RVs. I'm from the old school, and I like it that way." Old school was a kind description of how he camped. If it was made from anything other than canvas or leather, he considered it newfangled junk. My mother tried on multiple occasions to introduce things as common now as nylon tents, but he wasn't having it. He'd rather carry that big, musty wall tent everywhere we camped, and don't get me started about the stinking cans of kerosene that always leaked all over everything. He was certainly a man born too late. The term roughing it had to have been coined with him in mind. We continued to suffer through his archaic ways of experiencing the outdoors until the near death of my younger brother showed him the error of his ways. Throughout the early 80s, my dad would drag us out to the National Forest during Thanksgiving. The weather was relatively mild for this time of year, and the forest was beautiful. I can still smell the pine trees. These retreats always seemed to coincide with the hunting season for some reason. I remember hearing Dad used to hunt before meeting our mom. I think she forbade him from doing it anymore, so this was his way of sticking it to her. Either way, gunshots near camp were a common sound. I guess because our parents grew up with very little oversight, me and my brother Mike's childhood was the same. No one considered that it may be dangerous with a bunch of trigger-happy guys around to let two young boys play in the woods alone. It was normal for the two of us to leave camp at dawn, play all morning until lunchtime, then go back out until supper. We've been doing this as long as I can remember, and no one batted an eye. On one specific Thanksgiving, we had been running and crawling through the underbrush all day. This was during the time G.I. Joe and Rambo movies were at the height of their popularity. Mike and I loved dressing up in our camouflaged clothes and playing war. Mike's birthday had been just a few days before, and he got a pair of G.I. Joe walkie-talkies. Looking back, they were junk, but we loved them. After lunch, we returned to the woods. I can't remember exactly what I was doing at that moment, but I know Mike was trying to sneak up on me. I was sitting on a fallen tree and suddenly heard a loud bang, quickly followed by a whistling go by my head. I dropped flat on my stomach and waited for another shot. I wasn't sure what was happening, but something told me to stay where I was. No more than 30 seconds had passed when I heard faint moaning in the distance. Since Mike was missing at that second, I called him on the walkie-talkie. No answer came, but I heard a new noise. This sounded like my name, so I called to Mike again. No answer. Now I was getting scared. Without any other ideas, I yelled out his name. I told him the game was over and he needed to answer me. I wasn't sure if he was still trying to trick me or was in real trouble. I listened very intently, but nothing but the faint rustle of leaves could be heard. I walked in the direction of the rustle and listened again. Nothing. So I called out again. The rustling repeated, followed by another moan. I ran in that direction about 20 yards and stopped. The rustling came again, just to my right and very close. I couldn't see anything, so I dropped my stomach and scanned the ground. About 3 feet away, I spotted the bottom of a Nike. I knew it had to be Mike's. I ran to the bush he was laying under. The sight I came upon still breaks my heart to this day. There was Mike, staring up at me with a terrified look on his face. Just under his arm was a hole with blood pouring out of it. It shocked me, but I did my best to play it cool. I didn't want to make him any more scared than he already was. Had I been older, I may have known better how to move him, but I just reached down and scooped him up in my arms. He was too heavy for me, but I was going to do my best to save him. I made it about 100 yards before I had to set him down. He must have been in considerable pain. He asked me to leave him there and go get help. His voice sounded very weak, and I almost broke into tears right there. Somehow, I held myself together and ran another mile or so without stopping. Mom must have known something was wrong. She yelled out in a panicked voice for my father. My dad came out of the tent, took one look at me and said, "How bad is it?" I was too winded to speak. I just pointed him toward where I'd set him down and he took off. By the time I'd caught up, Dad was already picking him up and headed for camp. The entire ride to the hospital, Mom kept talking to him, telling him to hold on. I rode in the back seat, holding my shirt against the wound the whole way there. "What would have normally been at least a 30-minute drive took us just under 20. Dad handed him off to the doctors. They had him in surgery within the hour, and the next 3 were a long, living nightmare. More shocked at what had happened to my brother, I was in amazement at how calmly my parents were handling everything. Having become a parent since, I realized they were far from calm, but they handled it well either way. It was after midnight when the doctor gave us the news. They had been touch and go for a long time. I only found out much later that Mike had died more than once during surgery, but Mike had a good chance of recovering completely. The police, having been notified of the shooting, arrived soon after dawn to question us. Now that the urgency of the situation had passed, I broke down several times during my recollection. That was the first time I came to grips with the possibility that I could have been shot myself. Mike was going to be in the hospital for a few weeks, so my parents got a hotel room nearby. I think my dad considered staying at the camp, but after a very short discussion with my mom, he decided against it. The detectives handling the case kept us up to date, but as late as the day Mike was discharged, no names had been connected to the case. The most widely held theory is that a poacher mistook the movement in the bushes for a deer and fired. It accounts for the red flags during the search through hunting licenses. It wasn't the first time this happened, and sadly won't be the last. Mike was one of the fortunate ones. 34 years have passed since then, and nobody has been decisively connected to the shooting. Mike did make a full recovery and went on to start his own business and family, just like any other normal person. Something great did actually come out of this mess. We never returned to the National Forest, and even better, Dad decided with all of those fat tourists with their RVs being around, it was a safer environment for he and his family. Between 12 and 17, I got to spend my holidays in awesome places like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. This is the way I'd always thought camping should be, peaceful and quiet, and I'm almost positive Mike would agree with me. Although what I'm about to tell you may sound like one of your run-of-the-mill horror movies, I swear by the validity of it and what I saw. It all started on a very hot July day this past year. My car is almost 20 years old and sometimes overheats on hot days, just like this one. However, until I get a better paying job, it's the car I'm stuck with. This day I was driving through the back roads looking for a family of dog breeders a friend had told me about. I'd been searching for the place for several hours and was approaching the warmest part of the day. As per usual, my car began overheating and I was forced to pull over. I picked up my phone to call my girlfriend, only to see that my battery was dead. After I spent a couple of minutes cussing my luck, I acknowledged that I was going to have to find someone with a working phone. That wasn't going to happen unless I started walking. Soon, I spotted an old farmhouse off in the distance and headed toward it. A trip that would have taken half an hour on a normal day took almost an hour because of the oppressive heat. I had to take several breaks during the course of the journey, but eventually made it. The area around the house looked more like a junkyard. Parts of old cars spread about, and I had to weave through a maze of them to reach the front door. I knocked on the door for several minutes, but got no answer. Thinking maybe that the homeowner may be hard of hearing, I walked around and looked into the windows hoping to see someone inside. At the side of the house, I spotted the telephone hanging on the wall just inside the kitchen. Now that I knew that there was a phone, I became excited and started calling out for someone. Even after walking all the way around, no reply came. I was about to give up until I saw a woman lying on a bed. I very nearly banged on the window to try and get her attention, but I figured that may scare her, so I went to the front door and let myself in. Now in hindsight, that was just as scary. But before I entered, however, I took a piece of paper from a notebook I carry with me and wrote out a note explaining what I was doing there. Even then, I called out several times as I approached the bedroom. Still no answer came, and I continued toward the room. The closer I got to the woman, the more her appearance began to unnerve me. She was laying flat on her back and staring blankly at the ceiling. I had initially believed she was watching the television that was turned on in the room with her, but her eyes sat completely still. Regardless, I got closer and once I was within a few steps, handed her the note. When the note touched her hand, she didn't react. This caused me to get closer, and this was when I realized something was very wrong. Her face had a very dry, almost mummified look to it. Her hair was a vibrant black, a color not often seen on older females. She had to have known I was there by that point, but her eyes stayed fixed. This is what caused me to lean in even closer and look into her eyes. Rather than being slightly bloodshot or moist looking like most people's, they had a shiny, glassy appearance, like they were fake. In spite of this, not until I actually touched her did I know for sure that she was dead. I realized that perhaps she was a mannequin rather than a human, so I reached down to touch her bare hand. The texture of her skin was dry, but stone cold to the touch. The oddity of this was just beginning to really sink in, when a loud creaking noise came from behind me. Without a second thought, I tore out of there and ran back down the road in the direction of my car. Within a half of a mile, I ran into an older man in a truck, and thankfully he agreed to give me a ride back into town. I said nothing about my experience to him, and any time he attempted to make small talk, I said as little as I could, on the off chance that he may have been involved in what happened to that woman. He let me borrow his phone to call my girlfriend, and she agreed to meet us at a gas station on the edge of town. When he let me out there, I thanked him, and he went on his way. Once I was safely inside my girlfriend's car, I borrowed her phone to call the police. I hadn't even told her about it yet, so the look of shock on her face as I described what I saw showed me what my expression likely was at the time I discovered it. The cops said they'd send out a car to the house to check out my claims. I called a wrecker next to pick up my car. The police never called me back, so after waiting 3 days, I called to inquire about what they found. It took a few minutes to find a person aware of my call, but once I did, the officer said that he and his partner searched the entire property and found nothing out of the ordinary, especially not a mummified woman. I thanked them and hung up. What happened after I fled, I can only guess. The noise behind me was probably the owner of the home, and he hid the woman's body knowing that the cops were likely to be called. To tell you the truth, I'm not sure what I saw in that house, on that bed. I am positive that I saw a human lying on that bed, but that's all. More than once, I've been tempted to grab a camera and return to the house to get proof of my claims, but fear of the unknown and what else could be waiting for me if I did has stopped me. If the nightmares of her soulless eyes continue, however, I may have no other choice.
Back in the September-long weekend of 2011, me and my nephew took my 2 children, along with 3 of their friends, to our cabin at a nearby lake for the weekend. Our family has owned the cabin since they moved to Canada in the 1950s. It's located in a very rural area of Alberta. Earlier on the day in question, all 5 kids had been out of the woods, enjoying a game of tag. Well, not long after they started playing, one of the kids came running to tell me that there was a man wearing a gray shirt crouched in the bushes, and he was watching them play. As you can imagine, I was pretty concerned at this point, and I quickly went to check it out as calmly as possible. At this point, the rest of the kids also said that they had seen a man watching them. I went looking around for the man, but he was gone, and the dense bushes made it even more difficult to find him. At this point, I thought getting away from the cabin for a while might take everyone's mind off of the strange events. So we all packed up the car and we went to the beach. When we got to the beach though, there were police cars and emergency personnel all crowded at the beach and throughout the small town. We later found out that apparently 2 people had actually drowned in the lake that day. And in the end, going to the beach wasn't the distraction we had hoped for. Upon returning to the cabin at around 7 p.m., we ate food, the kids played, and we all set up beds in one room for peace of mind after the really strange events. Once the kids were in the room for the night, I went downstairs to the living room, which has a really large deck coming off of it, facing towards the woods. There's a sliding patio door leading onto the deck. My nephew and I were just chatting when we then heard a tapping noise coming from the back deck. At first, we didn't really think anything of it, but the noise just got louder and way more aggressive, as if it were coming closer. My nephew, who was in his early 20s at the time, came with me. I don't think I mentioned this, but I was a woman in my early 30s at the time, and we went to go check out where the noise was coming from. At that point, we saw a man wearing a gray shirt tapping an axe on the deck. I recognized the man as an ex who we have a restraining order against, and as soon as he saw my nephew, he took off. I immediately called the RCMP, which is the police, and within about 10 minutes, 3 units then showed up with their guns drawn. Thankfully, all the children were sleeping undisturbed in the bedroom upstairs. The police searched for a while, but they didn't find him, as it was really dark and there was a lot of thick brush surrounding our property. Needless to say, I ended up sleeping in the bedroom with all 5 kids that night. The next morning, we all packed up and left, not wanting a repeat of the previous night's events. Upon returning to the cabin a week or so later, the word "dead" was carved into one of the windows that was facing the woods.
I'm 21 and a type 1 diabetic. When I was around the age of 5 and 6, I would go to this diabetes camp for daytime. My mom would drop me off during the day and pick me up around noon or so. I remember doing lots of activities such as fishing, playing Twister, but one activity we would do sticks out to me most: swimming. This sticks out the most because when I was going to camp around 5 or 6, there was a teen male counselor. I don't remember his name, so we'll just call him Jay. Jay had a split tongue, and every time I was in my swimsuit getting ready to swim, Jay would look at me with such hunger in his eyes. When I would walk past him, as he would be sitting in a booth, he would always say how good-looking I looked and would wink at me. Jay would also try to get me to go places with him where no one was around. Now, when I was young, I didn't go off with anyone except for those who I knew. I was a shy, tiny child. One day, while me and my group were swimming, my counselor told me it was time to head inside. I was having a low episode, so I told her no. I am still very feisty when I'm low, and next thing I knew, I woke up in the camp infirmary. I had passed out in the pool from being low, and the lifeguard for the camp got me out and did CPR. When I was walking out, I saw Jay, and he asked me if she did mouth-to-mouth with me, and that it was hot if the lifeguard did. When my mom got me that day, I told her I didn't want to go back to the camp because I felt homesick. Yes, I did lie, but I felt that if I told her the truth, she wouldn't have believed a kid over an adult. Flash forward to 2019, I told her everything, and she apologized for those things happening and asked why I didn't tell her. And I just told her I was too afraid that no one would believe me. I don't know if this man remembers what he did, but I hope he hasn't trapped any other children.
When you go off to college, a lot of people warn you about the dangers that can occur on campus, but what no one warns you about is the ride home. While I'm sure most people have fun and possibly even memorable rides home from school with their family, mine was only memorable because I made it home with my life. It was the beginning of December and the fall semester had just ended, and at the time, I had made plans with some friends back at home to go see the midnight release of a movie that was coming out instead of taking my exams and then driving home the next day. I planned to drive home as soon as I finished my schoolwork. This meant that I left campus around 4 in the afternoon. I would make it to the mall for the movie just in time, so I did just that. I left right after my last test, and I could not have been more excited to see my friends. I had about a 6.5-hour drive ahead of me, so I got comfortable and began making my way home as quickly but safely as possible. Now that being said, even though I was in a rush, I was still raised to be helpful. I was always taught growing up that if you saw someone on the side of the road, you stop and ask if they need help. Sometimes people don't need anything and you just keep driving, but you never know when someone might need you. So at around 9:30 at night, as I was driving along this dimly lit back road, when I saw a car parked on the side of the road, I didn't even hesitate. I pulled over and hopped out of my car to ask if they needed any help. Right away, I could see the car was being driven by an elderly man, and he claimed that his car had a flat tire on the passenger side and asked me if I would help him put the spare on for him. I told him of course and asked him to pop the trunk so I could get the tire out, and he did. But as I leaned into the trunk to lift up the mat that covers the spare, I felt the man press something against my neck. My entire body tensed up as I could feel the shocks from the taser that he just pressed against me fired. I keeled over forward and the man was able to easily push me and force me into the trunk of his car before slamming it shut. I recovered from being tased before we pulled off from the side of the road. But as I reached above me for the emergency handle that it's in most trunks, I couldn't find it. I could feel the tires moving as we began making our way down the secluded back street when I realized the old man had forgotten to take my phone before locking me up. He must have been in such a hurry and didn't want to risk being overpowered that it didn't even cross his mind. I squirmed around in the trunk until I could get my hand into my pocket and pull my phone out. After calling the police and telling them what road I was just on, it was only a matter of a couple of minutes before they were able to find me. I heard the sound of police sirens behind us as they pulled the elderly man over, and once the car came to a stop, I began banging on the trunk to let the officers know where I was. Once the man was in custody and I was out of the trunk, I asked the officer if he knew why the man tried to abduct me, but he didn't know why. It wasn't until the trial that we learned that this man, who I thought was old and frail, had actually confessed to abducting multiple people between the 90s and the late 2000s. I was just the lucky one.
Because my parents had separated before I was born, I spent my time growing up between each of their houses. Each summer until I turned 19, I stayed with my dad in rural Missouri. He had grown up in the area himself and most of his family still lived there. Without much to do, like going to the movies and stuff, I would fill my days hanging out with my older cousin and getting into mischief. Many of our long summer days were taken in wandering the surrounding woods. On one of these journeys, we came across a big lake setting quietly by itself out in the middle of nowhere. The water was crystal clear and filled with tons of monstrous fish. We asked the adults if they were aware of its existence, but none had heard of it. That was probably the reason for it having so many large fish. No one living in the area had fished it, and any who had in the past allowed its location to be lost. We would fish the pond 3 or 4 times, coming away with a stringer full of lunkers on each occasion. On the 5th occasion, we hoped to accumulate enough for a big family fish fry. The summer holiday was starting to wind down, and we figured a fish fry would be a great way to cap it off. It was a warm Saturday morning when we headed out. We started about an hour before sunup because the walk-in took over an hour. Besides, the fish stopped biting by the hottest part of the day, and we hoped to get back to my dad's house by early afternoon. The beautiful sight of the pond came into view around dawn. It didn't take long for us to get our first bites, and for the next 3 hours the fish came quickly, one after another. Our limit was caught by 10:45, and I was rearing to get going. We had a 90-minute walk back with 2 5-gallon buckets packed to the top with fish, so I imagined another 30 could be added to that. To my displeasure, my cousin thought it would be refreshing to take a dip in the lake before we left. He tried to pressure me into joining him, but I didn't know how to swim at the time. I just wanted to get back, but he was older than me, so he was in charge. I plopped my tail onto a rock and waited while he did his thing. There was an old rope tied to a tree. probably from 100 years ago, and he wanted to swing from it. It looked unsafe to me. However, my concerns were laughed off, and he stripped down to his boxers, setting his clothes on the ground next to me. He climbed the tree a little way and grabbed the rope. Pushing off, he swung out just a short distance before the rope snapped right above him. He'd made it out far enough to hit the deep water, but probably not as far as he intended. When he hit the water, his body made a dull thud sound. It certainly didn't sound normal and likely hurt. I was planning on laughing at him and saying I told you so, but as the seconds passed, he never resurfaced. The situation was quickly becoming scary. I looked around to see if he came up somewhere farther away, perhaps floating unconscious because of the hard contact with the water, but still nothing. I began to panic and waded out as far as I dare, looking into the water for him. Unfortunately, the water became cloudy with every step I took and made it impossible to see. Soon it was clear to me that he had drowned. How, I had no idea. Perhaps if I could have swum back then, I may have been able to help him, but it was too late now. I was helpless to do anything more than pack up and head home. On the entire walk back, a small nugget of hope lingered in the back of my mind that he had tricked me and would pop up at some point. This didn't happen, however, and the dread I carried of telling my family grew with each step. I tried several times to find the words, but with each attempt, I would break down and choke on my tears. Ultimately, I could only manage, "Mark drowned." They got the point after that, and once I was able to pull myself together, I led my dad and uncle back out to the pond. Mark's body was still nowhere to be found. With no other options, we went into the sheriff's office to report the drowning. When I realized where we were headed, I started freaking out. In my young mind, I thought I was going to get in trouble or be blamed for my cousin's death. It took a few minutes, but they were able to convince me I wasn't in trouble. Even after they had, I couldn't help but feel guilty every time I looked at my uncle. Regardless of what he claimed, I couldn't believe he didn't blame me, even if it was just a small amount. I explained what had happened to the sheriff, and the search began the next morning. Just by chance, that was the day I was going back to my mom's. That Monday night, my mom sat me down to tell me that a team of divers had found Mark's body earlier that day. When they discovered him, one of his feet were hung up on a sunken log, so they assumed that was why he never resurfaced. I wish I could say this made me feel better, but it did not. It did, however, serve as a catalyst to learn how to swim. The guilt of not being able to help my cousin stayed with me for most of my life, and I never wanted to be in the position of not being able to help another person ever again. So in a twisted kind of way, his death had a positive impact on my life. However, if I had the choice, I'd still prefer that he be with us.
I remembered something that had happened to my best friend and I a few years ago, and I figured I would share it here. While my best friend and I were seniors in high school, we went on a weekend trip to visit my grandmother a couple hours away from my town in Georgia. The town that we lived in was comparatively small for the state, but one of the biggest towns within a few hours. But we had to travel about 2.5 hours through tiny, somewhat redneck towns to get to my grandmother's place. We were on our way back home when we had to stop at a gas station literally in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking cornfields, cotton fields, streets with no signs or lights, not even stop signs, and definitely no cell service. The convenience store that was attached to the gas station had maybe a couple snacks inside, but looked deserted from the outside, and we decided not to bother to get anything other than gas. I paid with card, mainly because I didn't want to leave my 5'1", 100-pound friend all alone in the car while I went alone inside. Another car had pulled up on the other side of the single gas pump while I just started pumping my gas, and because of everything I'd read before on Let's Not Meet, I already had a really weird feeling and decided to stay alert and stand outside of the car with my driver's side door wide open.
The reason I did this was so that my friend could see and hear everything that was going on. A thin, late 50s-ish older man got out of the car and seemed to be paying at the pump and standing beside his car while he got gas. But after a few seconds, he walked around the pump and then maneuvered himself around my car door to stand within a foot of me and asked if he could pump my gas for me. Luckily, the gas nozzle was locked, so it was pumping without me having to hold it. I immediately placed myself between the opening of the door and the man, and I prepared to either shut the door with me inside it or move and slam it behind me to protect my friend if necessary. I calmly told him it was fine and no thank you. He looked me up and down with the corner of his lip tilted up and then said,
"You know, pretty girls like you shouldn't be out here all alone, and you definitely shouldn't have to do this by yourself. Let a man help you, baby."
And then proceeded to cover my hand with his own as he reached for the gas pump that I was holding. I jerked my hand out from underneath his and then slammed my car door shut. I then jerked my hand out from underneath his and slammed my car door shut, thinking the last thing that I would want is him jumping in my car and driving away with my friend in the passenger seat. Red flags were totally going off now. My typical overly polite demeanor turned serious as I remember something that I'd read here that said that it was better to be safe and to seem mean rather than be polite and uncomfortable. So I then responded and said, "Sir, get away from me. I can pump my own gas and I've already said no thank you. Leave us alone." He didn't move, only raised his chin and managed to make eye contact with me, his tilted lip totally gone now. I stared him down and I figured I'd gotten enough gas to last us enough time to get the crap out of wherever we were. So I made eye contact, pulled the nozzle out, and basically threw it back into the pump before getting in my car and driving away before he had even moved. As we drove away, I glanced in the rear view and saw that his car wasn't even being filled up with gas. So I'm guessing he was just driving by and then decided to help out a damsel in distress, even though I was nowhere even close to being a damsel in distress. My friend was shaking the whole way home, telling me she would have just let the man pump our gas. But I'm really glad of some of the confidence that I'd gained from this sub. It helped me stay attentive and respond confidently enough to get out of that crazy situation. So to the creepy, helpful gas station man in the middle of Ghost Town, Georgia, hopefully we won't meet ever again.
I was helping my boyfriend move from Wisconsin to Colorado. I had driven out to Wisconsin and picked up some of his stuff, while he carried the rest of it in his own car. So we were driving separately. Somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, towards the end of the day, we found out that his car was having some issues that would need to be repaired before we could make the rest of the trip to Colorado. We decided to stay at the motel for the night and find somewhere to repair the car at in the morning. We took the car into the shop and it was actually able to be repaired before the end of the day. The shop called my boyfriend to let him know he could come pick it up, so I drove him out there. When we got to the shop, I realized that I'd left my phone at the motel. I wasn't too worried as even though I wasn't too familiar with the area, I figured I could follow my boyfriend as he drove back to the motel for the night. As I saw my boyfriend exit the shop in his car, other cars shortly followed behind him, so I lost track of him. I decided to try and find the way back to the motel on my own, to the best of my memory. It was pretty much just straight down the main road until you saw the sign for the motel on the left side. I kept driving down the main road until I realized I'd never even seen the motel sign. I was lost and I really started to panic as I had no phone and I had no idea how to get back to the motel. I began to notice a white SUV that was following my car for about 5 minutes. He eventually pulled into the lane to the left of me. Sitting at a stoplight, I saw the man in the white SUV motion to roll down my window. Being confused and not really knowing how to react, I rolled it down.
"Hey, what are you doing?"
He said. Nothing," I replied, not really sure why he was asking this.
"Well, why don't you pull over and come talk to me for a second?"
After hearing this, I quickly shook my head and then rolled up the window. The last thing that I wanted was to be stranded in this town with some weird stranger following me. The light turned green, and that's when I saw my boyfriend's car then pull up right behind mine. I then pulled off into the closest parking lot, to which my boyfriend followed. Luckily, the SUV was nowhere in sight. He said he was trying to catch up and find my car once he didn't see me at the motel. I let him drive me back that night so we could return for my car in the morning. Thank goodness my boyfriend had found me at the right time, as I'm not really sure what would have happened that night if he hadn't have found me, and if that man in the SUV had followed me any further.
Craigslist is almost never the first place I go when I need to buy something, but sometimes you can get good deals on things that would otherwise be really expensive. At the time, I was searching for new workout equipment. Weights and machines are really expensive to buy new, so Craigslist was the perfect way to find used ones for cheap. Anyways, I scrolled through the site for a few days before eventually finding a posting that looked really good. It was a set of weights for a pretty good deal and was posted only a few hours ago. The poster's name was Mary, so I sent her an email and told her I was very interested in her weight set and would like to pick them up as soon as possible. Mary replied just a few minutes later, saying that she was available tonight when she got home from work at 7. It was a little bit late, but it wasn't too big of a deal for me since I wanted them as soon as possible. I agreed, and she responded with her address. Of course, I looked it up to see where it was and what the house looked like. It was 20 minutes away in a small neighborhood that I was actually familiar with, as one of my old friends used to live nearby. The house was regular sized and didn't have any real defining features other than the fact that it looked pretty old, but nothing looked too strange or gave me bad vibes, so that night I drove down there. The place was at the end of the road in a cul-de-sac, so I parked on the side of the house by their mailbox and made my way up to the front door, which was already opened. I didn't want to just walk into the house, so I knocked on the open door a few times to get their attention. A moment later, a man comes down from the hall. Hi, I was supposed to meet with Mary to look at some workout stuff she had posted on Craigslist. The man's face lit up, and he said to come on in. He told me that Mary would be down in a few minutes, as she was changing out of her work clothes. This definitely made me cautious, but he sounded genuine and believable, so I followed him into his living room where there was a set of weights on the ground. However, aside from the weights, there was nothing else in the room, no furniture or decorations at all. I think the man saw me looking around, as he quickly said that they were in the process of moving out and that's why they were trying to sell the weights. Still skeptical, I looked at them for a second, but immediately noticed that a few plates were missing. I asked him if this was everything, as I thought I saw more in the pictures. He smiled again, telling me that Mary might know where the other ones are, but then he just stood there looking at me. I got really uncomfortable and asked him if he could go check on Mary to let her know I was here. He waited for a moment and then he agreed and walked up the stairs. I was obviously beginning to worry that Mary might not even be a real person at this point, so I listened intently to make sure he was talking to someone. After a few seconds of silence, I went over to the bottom of the stairs and looked up towards the top. The man was standing there at the top, just staring at the wall, probably waiting up there to make it seem like he actually went to ask someone. I fell into a panic, knowing now that this was all a lie and I was likely in the middle of something horrible. I started to quickly walk towards the front door, trying not to alert the man, but as soon as I turned around, I heard heavy footsteps rushing down the stairs. He called out for me to wait as I ran straight out the front door and into my car. Strangely, as I drove away, the guy ran out the front door and around the side of the house. I pulled over after driving out of the neighborhood and called the police to let them know what happened, in hopes that they could figure out what was going on. I didn't really know what the man's plan was, but I was confident enough that he was up to something. The officers later came by my house and I gave them more information. They told me that the house I met him at had nobody living there for over a year, which made chills run through my body. Of course, though, I couldn't really give them much helpful information other than a description of what the man looked like. And other than that, all they had to go off of was the weights that he'd put in the empty house that may have fingerprints on them. It worries me that he might still be out there trying to lure people into abandoned homes, but I'm also glad that I was able to make it out of there before he did whatever it was that he planned on doing.
I used to work at a gas station many years ago. I was the clerk in the convenience store that we had, and it was open 24 hours. So, as you can guess, I worked overnights, and when I did, I would be all by myself. Now, the gas station was located across the street from some stores, such as Target and a few others, so the area would get a lot of traffic during the day. A highway was also nearby, and the gas station was on a corner. At night, though, all of the other businesses nearby closed by 10 or 11. Things would be very quiet until probably 6 a.m. or so. I worked almost every night for a while, and was getting used to being there overnights. It was mostly pretty quiet, and the gas station would get cars here and there, but people rarely came inside. Between the hours of midnight and 5 a.m., the average amount of people that came inside was probably about 4 or 5, so roughly 1 per hour. One night, I was working, and it was a typical quiet night. By now, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. I was behind the counter, and nobody else was inside. No cars were at any of the gas pumps either. At one point, I saw a car pulling in from the street. It was a white van, one of those typical creepy-looking ones that was kind of old as well. It slowly drove up and parked in one of the spaces out front. I expected somebody to get out of the van and come inside, but instead, the van just sat there for a while. I didn't really have anything better to do other than to watch it, so I did. I couldn't tell who was driving, but soon I realized that they probably weren't going to come inside. After sitting there for maybe 20 minutes, the van eventually backed out. I thought it might leave, but instead it drove around to the side of the building. There was a few more parking spaces there, and it was now out of my sight. I honestly found this a little bit odd, and in the middle of the night, sort of creepy as well. I always tried my best not to let anything scare me though working overnights. After the van went to the side of the building, probably an hour or so went by. Now it was well past 3 a.m. Nobody came inside the store, and in that hour, only one car got gas. Then I noticed that somebody was walking on the sidewalk up towards the entrance. It appeared to be a man, and he had come from the side where the van had gone before. Could this be the driver? He was wearing a large black winter jacket, and the hood was up. He was looking down, so I couldn't really see his face at all. He made it to the doors, and then walked inside. After entering, the man walked to the right and away from me at the counter. After disappearing down an aisle, I focused my attention back down to my phone. Several minutes went by. When I looked up again, I noticed that the man was just standing there, about 40 feet away from me. He was facing me and looking in my direction with an angry look on his face. His hands were in his pockets, and I was confused as to what he was doing. After glaring at me for like 10 seconds, he didn't move or look away. I said hi to him and asked him if I could help him with anything. He didn't answer me and just kept standing there. Then I asked him if he was okay. The man still didn't answer me. I was really confused and not sure what to do. After standing there for a few more seconds, the man then turned and slowly walked out. Then he walked back down the sidewalk and returned to the side of the building. Less than a minute later, I saw the white van drive away. I was really glad that he was gone. The rest of my shift was pretty quiet. Eventually, a few more people came in. I was trying to figure out what that guy was doing, though, for the rest of my shift. His behavior was just really strange. I worked almost every night back then, and probably 3 nights later, I was working and it was about 2 a.m. or so. Once more, I was by myself and there were no customers. It was very quiet. Then I saw a car pulling into the gas station, and I soon realized that it was an old white van, just like the one from the other night. I remembered what had happened the other night, and I just hoped that it was not the same guy. I was already feeling creeped out. The van slowly drove around the gas pumps and over to the parking spaces out front. Then it turned and started to back into one of the spaces. After it parked, the van sat there for several minutes. But all of a sudden, I heard a car door open and soon saw what appeared to be the same man walking around it. He went to the very back of the van and opened it up. A short time later, he emerged holding something that looked like a crowbar. Then he closed the back doors to his van and started slowly walking to the entrance. He was wearing the same thing as the time prior. I had a bad feeling as I watched him slowly walk into the entrance doors. After getting inside, he then turned and started walking towards the back of the store. Quickly he went out of my sight, and everything in the store became extremely quiet. About 5 minutes went by. Then, all of a sudden, I heard a crashing sound. It seemed like the man had hit something, probably with his crowbar. I heard another sound after that. It was like he was just whacking stuff. Several seconds into this, he seemed to move closer, and then I saw him appear in an aisle a ways away. I got out from behind the counter and ran out of the store. They weren't paying me enough to stay in there and deal with it. I ran all the way to my car and got inside of it. Then I called the police. I waited there with the doors locked, watching the store. I was parked behind the gas pump, so I was a decent ways away from the store. Probably about 3 or 4 minutes after I called the police, I saw the guy leaving. He slowly walked out and went back inside of his van. Then he drove off. Less than a minute after he left, the police arrived. I told them that the man was gone, and we went inside the store to see that lots of things were off the shelves. It was all messed up from the guy whacking it with his crowbar. It was like he had gone on a rampage. We watched the whole thing unfold on surveillance tapes, and the guy was just whacking stuff. Then he calmly left. It was the craziest thing that I had ever seen. After that incident, the police investigated to try to look for the guy. They also had a police officer at the store overnights for the next week or so. The guy didn't come back, and I didn't work there for much longer either. I'm glad that I quit that job, because ever since it happened, I was really nervous working there at night.
Sorry, but be prepared for a fairly long story. Here goes. I was living in Hawaii and had to move to LA for work. Didn't know anyone and was fairly broke, and my job wasn't going to help with the moving expenses. So I had to resort to scouring Craigslist for a room to rent. After literally thousands of scams or weirdos, I finally find this amazing girl. She was funny, we had similar interests, and she even worked in the same field as me. She didn't have a place yet, but her and another girl were looking at several houses that required a third roommate. They were totally okay with doing all the work, seeing as how I was an ocean away. She called or Skyped with me about once a week, and sent me pictures of each house they looked at. All in all, she was pretty incredible. Fast forward 3 months. They found a huge and gorgeous house. Everything was settled. The 2 girls, Evan and Juliana, were moved in. And Evan, the original girl from the Craigslist, picked me and all of my stuff up at the airport. On the ride home, she starts telling me horror stories about her past roommates. Every single one had f***ed her over in some horrendous way, and she was terrified of being close to people after that. She said she wanted us to be the people who turned that around for her. She wanted us to be like a little family. Instead of going directly to the house, we went to a nearby Starbucks, where she chain smoked and told me about her stepdad who was in AA, and how she'd briefly been attending NA meetings after a short bout with a painkiller addiction. She decided she wasn't a drug addict and didn't need it. Then, she admits that she's only known the other roommate for a month and a half. Red flags are starting to pop up all over the place. Why would an LA native need to find strangers to live with her on Craigslist? Why the oversharing about drugs in her family? Why had she never had a positive roommate experience? Pushed it all aside, giving this girl the benefit of the doubt. A few weeks go by in the house and all's well. I forget she ever seemed off and we start becoming closer and closer. She then takes me on a tour of LA for a day and proceeds to tell me her entire disturbing life story. When I say we gotten close, by no means were we close enough to make this appropriate. She tells me about her stepfather molesting her, getting sent to a mental hospital when she told on him because he's a doctor and she said she was criminally insane, then getting raped by a lesbian at the hospital and beaten by the guards, then attempting suicide, as well as her mother's severe narcotic addiction, her then ex-fiancé having a psychotic break and trying to kill her, her struggles with chronic kidney illness that required many surgeries, her recent long-term boyfriend disappearing under mysterious circumstances. The horrific stories just went on and on and on. It sounded like something from a movie, and part of me questioned if it could all be possibly true. But again, I was giving her the benefit of the doubt. Things go fine for a while, and my doubts about her subside. And my food starts disappearing. I asked both girls about it privately, and Evan claims that the other girl, Juliana, had confessed to her that she was a compulsive overeater. Naturally, Juliana claims to be innocent. I side with Evan, and we start mildly bullying Juliana to try to get her to admit that she was stealing the food. And dishes start piling up in the sink, and nobody is washing them except me. I ask both girls, and again, Evan swears on her life that it's Jules. Finally, Jules has had enough. It turns out she's been eating out every meal. We all had very different schedules, and Evan lied to my face about the dishes and food. When confronted, Evan starts crying and saying, "How could you accuse me of such things? I'm a good person. I'm a good person." We ended up apologizing to her in the end. Finally, tension builds between the two girls due to many repeats of this situation. And one night, when I'm at work and they start fighting, Evan calls me saying that Juliana hit her and she's afraid for her life. I call Jules and tell her to find a new place to live. Juliana goes to stay with friends, and within a week she moves out. Now this is where things get really weird. Evan moves out of the master bedroom and starts sleeping in the living room every single night. After I repeatedly request that she return to living in her own bedroom, she tearfully confesses that she's been on high-dose opiates this whole time. She's trying to wean herself off, but it makes her too weak to walk downstairs. Feeling sorry for her, I end up babysitting her for a few weeks while she withdraws. It was both terrifying and disgusting. I really wanted to help her out. During this time, I see her naked and realize that she has no scars from her quote-unquote repeated surgeries. Beyond that, she confides in me that she hasn't been working at all this entire time, but going out to score drugs and get high every single day. And now, she's flat broke. She apologizes for lying and saying over and over that she's a sick addict and just needs help. I get her into AA and NA as soon as she's able to walk, driving her to her daily meetings and holding her hand the entire time. My longtime boyfriend and her oldest friend move in with us a short while later to help with the bills. That's when it all goes from bad to unbearable. Evan goes to visit her mom one night and disappears for a week, returning very clearly high and claiming to be sober. She then starts going on many trips to visit friends in other states and is rarely home. When she is home, she babbles endlessly about how great sobriety is, and how she's finally healing, while clearly nodding out on opiates. I end up finding something suspicious on her computer, and she openly admits to me that she's been working as a call girl, bringing customers to our house. I tell her this has to stop, and she claims she already has. Around this time, she becomes very physically ill. Finally, I get a phone call from her after another absence. She's hysterical. She's, get this, 6 months pregnant. She didn't know because she was so high. The baby was severely malformed and there was no way of carrying it to term. I tried comforting her, thinking that this trauma outweighed all the weird behaviors she's exhibited. She had the procedure and afterwards disappeared for almost a month. I thought at one point she was dead until she texted me asking if her cat was okay. When she returned, she proceeded to start eating all of our food, using all of our toiletries, sleeping on the couch, and smoking inside the house, which was not okay with us at all. She was very clearly on drugs again. At first, we tried to be nice about it, but she lied and lied and lied, even going so far to say her room was haunted and the ghost made her sleep upstairs. Finally, my boyfriend snaps and yells at her. She calls the cops and claims he assaulted her. They didn't believe her, but the other roommate did. And one night when I'm at home, she uses pity and sweet talking to convince my boyfriend that we should all be friends again. I told him it was a lie, and he didn't believe me. When I get home from work that same night, my room is trashed. I asked if he did it, and of course, he claimed he didn't. She'd been in there looking for cash or drugs, which I don't do. When I asked her about it, she looked me straight in the eyes and said, it was a ghost. After that, she started sending me insane emails, claiming that I'd been her best friend and betrayed her, accusing her of heinous crimes, and even convincing her that she was a drug addict as a form of a sick psychological torture. The emails get increasingly intense, becoming 10 to 20 pages about how she didn't feel safe in her own home, and how I was the embodiment of pure evil, and that my only purpose in life was to torment her. In these emails, she claimed that she used drugs on rare occasion, and that I'd made everything about her problems up, and that I'd been verbally abusive about her abortion, and that we had repeatedly physically assaulted her. We were genuinely afraid for our safety, especially after the police showed up one day and took her in for a mysterious psychiatric hold. We never found out why she was carried out of the house, barefoot and handcuffed by 4 LAPD officers. After that, we just tried to avoid her, but she got that other roommate involved again. She went as far as to claim that she had pneumonia from the stress of living with us, and our constant abuse. The emails continued to escalate. At one point, she said that I had been a sister to her, until the evil spirit in me had forced me to abuse her. This was when I realized that her definition of abuse was a bit skewed, and all her stories about her childhood, exes, old roommates, and even Juliana had been complete fabrications. Of course, she didn't have scars from the surgeries. Everything she said was a lie, just to garner sympathy so she could take advantage of people. Now, I realized this, of course, finally, and that she was completely mad. We found a new house, and the night before moving out, I hacked into her email. Come to find out, she had been telling our landlord that we were heinous criminals, telling her parents that she had been fired from a job because of me and needed money. All kinds of lies. Also, we came to find out that the guy who gotten her pregnant didn't mysteriously disappear. He ran away because they slept together once and she started stalking him. Obviously, everything she had ever said was a creepy little lie. After moving out, the harassing emails and texts continued to the point that I have her blocked on both and seriously consider getting a restraining order. This was 2 years ago. Last month, we found out this girl who had claimed to have never been a drug addict, and that I made all of it up and died of an OD. She was evil. This wasn't a situation where nobody tried to help a sick person. Everyone around her tried to help her, and she manipulated and used every single one of them. I don't feel sad that she's gone. In fact, I still want to punch her in the face. TLDR, my roommate decided to be a drug-addicted, lying, stealing sociopathic prostitute who semi-stalked me via email and text.
I worked as a Walmart cashier for a little over a year. I quit in August of 2015 when I went away to college. As a cashier, you see a lot of people in a day, especially at Walmart. And after a while, you don't even see people's faces when you look at them, but there are some people that you see so often you start to recognize and sometimes learn their names. There was this one guy, always in the same Green Bay Packers hoodie and Chicago Cubs baseball cap, that would often seek out my line no matter how long it was, just so he could stare at me and rarely say a word. Whenever he did say anything to me, he would always lean across the register to get closer to my face. He always gave me a really bad vibe, but when I asked other cashiers about him, they said that he had never been weird around them. One of the girls even said he was a close family friend. After that, I dropped the issue. One night after I'd been there for about a year, I was working a 2 to 11 shift. Those shifts were always the worst because you'd be there for 3, sometimes 4 front-end managers, but also because it takes the chunk out of your day when you were actually going to do anything. So I'm down on the self-checkout. It's about 10:15, so I'm counting the minutes until I can shut it down at 10 to 11. The creepy guy comes in the front door and makes a beeline for me at the self-check podium. When I see him come in, I instantly get nervous. He walks up and says, "Can I still buy a cell phone card and electronics?" I told him I only worked as a cashier on the front end, so I didn't know anything about electronics, but he could go back and check. He seemed peeved by this answer, but he walked away without another word. About 10 minutes later, he comes up with a prepaid phone card and said there's no one at the register in electronics, so I activate his card and hand it to him, telling him to have a good night, but he pushes the card back at me without saying a word, and I say, "Is something wrong?" To which he replies, "These minutes aren't on my phone yet, are they?" I was confused by this statement because, of course they weren't. He had just bought the card. I shook my head, and he waved the card in front of my face. "Why the fuck are you just standing there? Reactivate my phone." When he talked, he was so close I could smell his breath, and I was a little scared. I wanted to put in the call to my manager so that someone could come down and help me. This is where I should probably mention that I'm about 5'3", and he is closer to probably 6'5", and very stocky, so he was towering over me, and the thought that he could easily overpower me crossed my mind, but I get so nervous whenever men yell or cuss at me because my dad was never the type to yell or cuss. I took the card out of his hand and he slammed his cell phone on the scanner. I was trying not to let him know I was nervous, but I was terrified. I knew I had never put minutes on a prepaid phone before, but I don't dare tell him that in fear of what he might do. So I read the directions, pick up his phone, dial the number, and as I'm putting in the card number, his phone runs out of minutes. I try to call back and get an error message. I'm at a loss. I meekly hand him his phone back and say, "I'm sorry, something went wrong. I don't know what is happening." As soon as I say it, he takes his phone, opens it up, tries to dial someone, and when it doesn't work, he looks at me with furious eyes. He screams, "What the fuck did you do to my phone? What the fuck?" His voice is echoing in the store, and unfortunately we haven't gotten the end of second shift rush yet, so there is no one around. He closes his phone and opens it again, trying to make another call, but when it doesn't work, he throws the phone down on the scanner again. He says, "I don't know what you did to my phone, but you better fucking fix it." But this comes much more quietly, practically a whisper. At this point, I'm worried he's going to put his hands on me, and I don't know what to do. I put in a call for a manager from my register, and then I say, "I've called someone that might be able to help, but we're at shift change right now, so it might be faster for you to take it to the customer service desk." He picks up his phone off the podium, still mumbling under his breath that I fucked up his phone, and I'm hoping I can get out of there before he comes back, or at least have someone else down at the self-check with me. Another 15 minutes go by, and I don't see him again. As I'm picking up items that people left by the registers, getting ready to shut them down for the night, he comes back and stands by the podium. He still looks completely pissed off, and my stomach has sank. He made that finger motion that means come here without saying anything, and for some reason that makes me even more nervous. When I'm standing in front of him, he leans so close to my face that I think he's about to kiss me or bite me or God knows what. I try to take a step back, but he takes a step forward when I do. A creepy grin comes across his face as he says, "The girl up there fixed it. Simple fix. But next time, I expect you to know what to do. Understand?" I nod because I don't think I can speak. He gets impossibly closer before saying, "I'm sorry I raised my voice. I never should have done that, especially to a pretty girl like you." When he adds the last part, he lightly uses his fingertips to brush my bangs to the side. I took a step back and he said, "Let me make it up to you. Let me buy you a drink." I shake my head. I say, "No thank you, I'm only 19. He says, "So we'll get a couple of beers and go back to my place." Again, I shake my head. "No, it's really okay. I'm not much of a drinker. I have an early morning tomorrow." He looks displeased with this answer and says, "Tell you what, I'll wait over here by the door just in case you change your mind." I smile at him weakly and tell him to have a good night. When I see him walk through the security, I quickly shut down the registers and sign out of mine. Then I run over to find a manager to tell about the whole thing. The third shift manager that I tell looks at me like I'm lying, and when I'm finished says, "I know Todd. He wouldn't hurt a fly. He doesn't have it in him. You're probably just being dramatic." She then turns to another older cashier behind her, shakes her head and mumbles, "Teenagers." I ask if I can have someone to walk me to my car, and they tell me that management is in a meeting and the security guy went home already. So I clocked out and went to the bathroom. I waited in the bathroom for about 10 minutes before coming out and attempting to go to my car. When I walked around the corner through the security things, he wasn't sitting on the bench right there like I had been expecting. I relaxed a little before I realized he was standing just outside the door, far enough away to keep it from closing, smoking a cigarette. He has his back turned toward the door. Luckily, I never went out the front doors. I always went to the corridor and not the side door. I quietly closed the door behind me so maybe I wouldn't catch his attention. I rushed to my car, which was fortunately very close to the building. As I'm quick walking to my car, I hear him shout, "Hey, why are you avoiding me? Come here." At this point, I take off into a full-on sprint, which is not easy because I'm wearing Sperry's, so it's like running in clogs. I get to my car, get in, lock my doors as I'm starting it, and don't even bother with my seatbelt. By that point, he had made it almost all the way to my car and was still yelling, telling me he just wanted to talk. I took off as fast as I could and took the longest way home with the most turns and twists that I could. When I got home, I told my dad about the experience, and he was so angry that no one had answered my calls or believed me. He called the store manager the next day and complained. I was never contacted about his complaint, but from that night on, whenever I saw that guy, I would run to the bathroom, or if I couldn't get away, I would put out my lane closed sign and turn off my light so he couldn't get in my line. And you always hear people talking about the people of Walmart as being trashy, but they never tell you about the select few that are scary as hell.
I lived with a friend of mine, who I'll refer to as Nick, in a small house for a few years during college. He was my roommate for the first year, and then we decided to move out of the dorms and share the rent on a house since we both had decent enough jobs. This was both of our first times renting a place, so we didn't really know how to budget properly. After a few months, everything was okay, but it was almost a year in when we realized that this place was eating up both of our bank accounts. So the obvious solutions were to either move out or find another roommate. Neither of us wanted to leave, so we started the search for a roommate. We started by asking all of our other friends, but none of them were interested, so really the only option was to put up a post online. I made a post on Facebook Marketplace, and Nick made a post on Craigslist. Again, neither of us have ever done this, and it felt kinda weird, but we knew we didn't have much of a choice. A few weeks went by, with just a couple of responses, but none of them seriously considering moving in, before Nick shows me an email he got from someone named Sam, replying to his Craigslist post. The guy seemed legit, and the following day he came over to view the house. I should mention, he was a couple years older than us, and had just graduated, but he seemed pretty nice, and looked clean and everything, so we were glad to have him. He agreed to the split of rent, and moved in the next week. In the few months following, Sam would hang out with us a lot, and we actually got to know him pretty well. But then all of a sudden, he became very closed off for some reason. Nick and I would barely ever see the guy, and when we did, he wouldn't even talk. He would sit in his room for the most part, with his door shut, and would only come out to get food or to go to work. It didn't bother me necessarily, I just found it a little strange. Anyways, it was around month 4 with him being there that things started to take a turn for the worst. I had just gotten home from work, and immediately as I walked through the door, Nick calls my name quietly from the living room. "What's going on?" He mentions that Sam was home, so to not talk too loud. Then he tells me about a strong smell he noticed when passing his room today. I told him I hadn't noticed it. He points down the hall towards Sam's room and tells me to quietly walk past and see if I notice. So I got up and made my way quietly down the hall towards Sam's door. I didn't even have to get very close to smell what he was talking about. It was awful and really disgusting, I had no idea what it was, and had definitely never smelled it in the house before. Nick suggested we ask him what it was, and I agreed. We both went to his door, trying not to breathe in too hard, and knocked. Then knocked again and again, calling out to him. He didn't answer. Nick said he was sure that Sam was in there, but after a couple more minutes we just gave up and figured we'd ask him tomorrow. It was already pretty late at this point, so we both made a quick dinner and then ate while watching TV in the living room, and then we both went to bed. The next day, I caught Sam on his way out of the house and asked him what the smell was last night. I was just taking out the trash. He quickly left and drove off. That answer didn't really make any sense to me, but I didn't want to press him too hard. I told Nick later that day, and he agreed that it was weird, but didn't know what else to do, so we left it at that. Another couple weeks go by. Again, Sam barely talked to us, but the smell had gone away by now. I got home from work late one night, and Nick and Sam were both in their rooms, already asleep probably, so I pretty much went straight up to my room and fell asleep as well. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up hearing some movement below my room, which was where Sam's room was located downstairs. I listened for a couple minutes, trying to figure out what he was doing, but eventually I fell back asleep. The next morning, Sam ran out of the house to go to work as usual. However, he didn't return home that night. Another couple days would go by, and he still hadn't come home. I called him multiple times, and his phone instantly went to voicemail. We were actually starting to get worried, and decided to check his room to see if there were any clues as to what was going on. His room was pretty messy, and actually kind of looked like a lot of his stuff had been packed up and taken out. I also found a pair of glasses in his drawer, with some other random belongings, which was weird because Sam didn't wear glasses. He left some clothes and all of his furniture behind though, which made us believe that he didn't just move out suddenly. Nick ended up calling the police to notify them about Sam possibly being missing, and an officer arrived that night to investigate and ask us questions. We told him everything we knew and let him look at his room. Nick also gave him a picture that we had taken together back when Sam first moved in. After that, we didn't get an update until a week later. A different detective called us and informed us that the identity of the man in the photo with us was not Sam. They said a family member recognized them as their missing son who had been gone for almost a year. After that, the case got a lot more complicated, and we didn't have much helpful information because the guy pretty much lied about everything he told us. So after a little bit, we lost contact and stopped getting updates. As far as we were told, the man was just some regular guy that was living with his parents, who suddenly went missing for no known reason. He never came back to our house though, and I'm not sure if he was ever found. It's definitely the most interesting and creepy experience I've had though. Just knowing that I was living in the same house as someone who made up a completely fake identity and was legally missing gives me chills every time I think about it. It's pretty hard not to assume that this man was trying to hide from the police because of something he had done, or was still doing.
This happened to me at barely 20 years old. I had just gotten off second shift at my job. A couple of friends who also worked with me asked if I wanted to hang out at the beach. I was planning on going home and ordering a pizza and maybe watching some TV. But it was a Friday night in July, and going to the beach sounded like a good idea. I'm a female, but two of my friends were male. We had worked and hung out together for around 3 years, so I trusted them completely, and I didn't have any worries about going to the beach with them that late at night. We chose a beach/park that was in a safe area of where I grew up. As I turned into the beach access road off to the main road, I thought that I'd seen someone walking in the picnic area. I mentioned it to my friends, but they said they didn't see anyone, so I just chalked it up to a shadow from the full moon. I parked and we then got out and started walking to the sand. The night was warm and breezy, I remember we were laughing at something one of us said, and we were all just really carefree. That is, until we saw him. For context, the beach access road sloped down, curving to the right. The road could be accessed from the back of the picnic area by going through a sloped area of the trees. Now, there was a cemented path that led down the beach, but that was farther away from the picnic area. So this guy chose to keep his balance while fighting his way through sloped trees to get to the road, and I guess to us. And he was fast. The moonlight briefly outlined his physique. He was huge. We immediately whipped around and started running back to my car. And just like a scene in a scary movie, I fell. I didn't care though if I hurt myself or not. So I got right back up and kept on pace. My car was a piece of crap and the doors didn't lock. This was a good thing that night. We jumped into the car and I started fumbling in my front pocket to try and find my keys. I got my car started and I put it in drive. I just barely got my foot on the gas pedal before the guy caught up close enough to punch my trunk. I drove right the fuck out of there like a bat out of hell. We drove to a populated area a few miles away before any of us said a word. I had skinned up my knee pretty damn good as I ripped a hole in my jeans when I fell. I also had road rash all over my hands. I frequented that beach until I moved to another state a couple of years later, but I never went back there at night again.
I had just graduated college, and I needed a small place to stay while I searched for a new job. I worked part-time at a small grocery store, but now that I graduated, it was time to start looking for a better job. Anyways, apartments were way too expensive to rent on my own, so I was mainly looking for places with spare rooms for rent. I knew it would be awkward for a while living in someone else's house, but I didn't have much of a choice, to be honest. My old roommate from college suggested looking on Craigslist, as most other sites at the time didn't let you post single rooms in a house, or maybe it was just really hard to find them. Either way, Craigslist seemed to have a ton of options to choose from, so I stuck with it. After a few days though, I started to get frustrated, as none of the people would reply to my requests, and the ones that did would just apologize and say it was already taken. But then on Saturday morning, a new room popped up. It was nearby, cheap, and looked pretty nice. In the description, a man named Tom was advertising it as a large house with a spare bedroom for rent that also had a separate bathroom and closet. This sounded perfect to me, so I emailed him about my interest and then went to work. I knew the listing had just been posted that morning, so I felt confident that I was the first one to contact him. On my lunch break, I checked my emails and Tom had replied, asking me to come and view it that afternoon. I knew I'd be tired after work, but I also really wanted this place, so I agreed and we set a time. After work, I drove straight there, which was only about 10 minutes. From the outside, the house looked really nice. It honestly just looked like a regular medium-sized neighborhood home. I parked on the side of the road and walked up to the door, then lightly knocked. After 30 seconds, I knocked again, a little bit harder this time. A minute later, I pulled my phone out to text Tom, but just before I sent it, he opened the door and invited me in. I immediately noticed he was sweating a lot, as if he had just finished a long workout, and he smelled awful. I didn't want to be rude or anything, so I just ignored it. He began walking me around the ground level floor, showing me the kitchen and the living room. He mentioned that he didn't use these rooms often, so I wouldn't have to worry about getting in his way. From the look of the rooms, though, it seemed as though he used them too often. Old dishes were piled up in the sink, and the couch had stains all over it. I really didn't like how dirty the whole place was, and it was strange that in the pictures it looked like the house was really clean. One thing I remembered specifically was that the living room had a brown leather couch in the picture, but the couch that was actually there was black. I figured Tom had probably used the pictures of the house from years ago before it sold. I was a bit annoyed at the dishonesty of it, but all that really mattered was my room, which was upstairs. Tom led the way to the stairs, then stopped when he reached the bottom of the steps and held his hand out in a gesturing manner as if he wanted me to head up first. I got a weird and uncomfortable feeling as I started up the stairs, as Tom didn't follow me. He stayed at the bottom and smiled, saying that my room would be the first one on the left. I continued to the top and took a couple steps into the hallway before a soft thud came from behind the door to what was said to be my room. I looked back down the stairs at Tom, whose smile was now completely gone. Does someone else live here?" He replied in an annoyed tone, telling me that it was just one of his friends staying the night and not to worry about it, then urged me to check out the room for myself as he was sure that I'd like it. I was definitely pretty nervous at this point, scared even. Why wouldn't he have told me that someone else was here? It seemed like something that I should know. Everything started adding up, and all I wanted was to get out of there right away. I tried to act confident and began walking down the stairs as I explained that the place wasn't going to work out for me. He didn't seem to like that answer, and he moved his body to block most of the bottom of the stairs. I stood a couple steps away and firmly told him that I needed to leave. He asked me again to check out the bedroom to at least see if I liked it, and again I said I was not interested. He looked at me for a moment. Then, to my surprise, he smiled and said okay, stepping aside. I quickly walked past him and straight out the front door. I don't know what was going on in that house, but something didn't feel right about any of it. I even felt lucky to have been able to leave so easily. In the moment, I thought I was going to have to force my way out. I checked Craigslist a couple hours later, and the posting had been removed. I still wonder who and what was in that room upstairs. For all I know, it could have just been an empty room, but something tells me that it was something much worse.
Okay guys, yesterday was probably one of the worst days I've ever endured, and it all started with a phone call at about 7 a.m. I picked up my phone to see who was calling me so early. But since I didn't recognize the number, I just put it on silent and fell back asleep. When I woke up again 3 hours later, I saw that I had 12 missed calls and 8 new voicemails. Panic started to set in as I thought something horrible had happened to one of my family members. As I looked through all the missed numbers though, I realized that I didn't know who any of these people were. I thought that was really strange, since if something bad had happened to a family member, I should at least recognize one of these numbers. Things got weirder as I heard the first voicemail.
"Hi, I was just giving you a call about the house you have for sale. I saw the Craigslist ad and was hoping to figure out a time I could be given a walkthrough. Just give me a call back, thanks."
I figured that was the wrong number and played the next one.
"Yeah, hi. I was calling about the house for sale on Craigslist. If you could, give me a call back. I'd really like to know some more stuff about those murders before I take a walkthrough. Thanks, and have a nice day."
After hearing the second voicemail, I was really starting to wonder what the hell is going on here. The other 6 voicemails were all pretty much the same thing, inquiring about setting up a walkthrough and wanting to know about these quote-unquote murders. After I finished listening to the last one, I needed to find out what the fuck is going on. I called the last number to leave a voicemail and a woman answered. When I asked her about the house she was calling about, she said there was an ad on Craigslist offering a house for dirt cheap. But it was only so cheap because the post said that a couple had been murdered inside the house. I asked her if she could text me the link, and she assured me that she would. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed and I saw her number pop up on its screen. I had no idea what I was in store for by clicking on that link. So when the webpage opened, the coldest chill I've ever felt shot down my spine. I saw a picture of my house on Craigslist for sale. What made it worse was it was the picture that had been taken within the last week. You could see the pumpkin that I carved last weekend. And then I read the posting description. I have this sweet little home that I'm putting up for sale. It's located in this town. Just a hop, skip, and a jump away from the city. Enjoy all the seclusion and privacy that this house will bring you. My asking price is $25,000. Disclosure: there is a reason I'm asking basically nothing for my house. The previous couple who lived there, a young man and a woman, were murdered in the house about a year ago. I figured it would get out in the open now so that I'm only contacted by people who are not bothered by this. Don't let this little mishap dissuade you though. The neighborhood is very safe. I promise. You can call, Then they listed my name and number at any time, day or night. I never sleep. And we can set a time to take a walkthrough of my house. I look forward to hearing from you soon. With a winky face. I felt like I'd been socked in the gut. What the fuck is going on? How did they know my number, my name? I immediately called my girlfriend over to see. I could see the horror set in on her face as she looked through the ad. I don't think I could feel any worse until she pointed out how our car was in the picture. We were in the house when someone took these pictures. I immediately called the police to figure out what the hell to do. They informed me that I should immediately contact Craigslist to remove the posting. Other than that, there was nothing really we could do at the moment. The only crime that had technically been committed would be trespassing, but since whoever took that picture wasn't on our property anymore, it really couldn't do anything else. I'm freaking the hell out. My girlfriend was on the phone with her mom in hysterics for most of the day yesterday. Today, we've just been on constant alert. Every sound we hear makes us jump. I think the worst part is, I know there's really nothing I can do. I feel so violated, and so completely helpless.
This happened about 4 years ago. I was 20 years old at the time. The first time I met the guy who would become my grocery store stalker, he was standing outside the store collecting money for the Salvation Army's Christmas time donations. I'm a fairly friendly person, so I like to say hi to people who work at places I frequent just to be nice. This guy was a kid around my age, very tall, with a mild resemblance to Lurch from the Addams Family. Dark circles under dark eyes, short black hair, and a kind of vacant look in his eyes. I chatted with him for maybe about 2 minutes, kinda just idle chit-chat about the weather and whatnot. Nothing particularly memorable or interesting. I then waved goodbye and went home. Little did I know that that single moment would be the start of something that would have me genuinely afraid. About 4 or 5 months passed and I hadn't seen him again. Then one day as I was grocery shopping with a friend, when, as we were chatting, she suddenly got really quiet and kind of recoiled backwards, then looking behind me. I turned around to see this guy who had to be at least 6'4", towering over me, not 8 inches from my body. He said hi and he told me that he remembered from that December that I had talked to him, and then asked for my number. I, being young and had never really experienced this type of interaction before, told him that I didn't have my number memorized, but that I would write his down and then maybe text him later. I kinda half-waved my phone at him, pointing at my at-the-time boyfriend, whose picture was my wallpaper, making a point to say, "Oh look, that's my boyfriend," to the guy, hoping he would clue in. But no luck. He told me his number, which immediately upon getting I blocked, without letting him get my number. However, what really made my blood run cold was what he said to me after I put my phone away. He leaned in real close to me and in a really low voice, then told me,
"Whatever I text you is for your eyes only."
I start to feel genuinely uncomfortable at this point. I said back, yeah, sure. It was nice talking to you, but we gotta get back to shopping. And I grabbed my friend and dragged her off, shooting a panicked look at her and asking her why she didn't bail me out. Apparently he scared her too with him getting so close to me, and she just didn't know what to do. I also want to make it clear that I'm not exactly a small girl. I'm 5'8" and solidly built. I can certainly handle myself, and I very rarely ever feel intimidated or small in the presence of anyone, male or female. But this guy, he really made me feel tiny and scared. In the months that would follow, he would make me feel truly frightened. I had really hoped that that creepy interaction would be the last time I saw him, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. After that initial meeting with him saying that creepy thing about his text being for my eyes only, it seemed like I would run into him every single time that I got into the store. No matter what checkout lane I was in, he always seemed to appear at the end of it when I was finished shopping, and every time I was in the store, I would always notice him out of the corner of my eye watching me, no matter what area I was in. One time I even caught him following me out to my car. At that point I got scared and I finally decided to say something to the managers. After letting all the managers know what was going on, they then assured me that they would tell him not to talk to me. After that he wouldn't speak to me, but I would continue to see him following me around the store at a distance every single time I went up there. It got so bad and I felt so terrified that I started to be afraid to go to the store at all. But I'm one of those stubborn people who refuses to be intimidated by someone to the point where I'll stop doing something. I had really hoped that maybe it was just a coincidence that he was following me. After all, it was a really big store, and maybe he just had things to do that just happened to be in the same areas I was shopping in. So I started to pay close attention to my surroundings. Once I started really paying attention, I realized that every single time I was up there, I would constantly notice him in the same areas in the store that I was in. During my last encounter with him, I had went to the store to just grab 2 or 3 items that I needed for dinner that night, and I first saw him standing at the store when I got there, and with his back facing me, I quickly ran inside, hoping he didn't see me. Unfortunately, a few minutes later, I had saw him at the very back of the store, and items in hand, I immediately made a beeline towards the front. As soon as I got near the checkout, I ducked behind one of the shelf displays and watched carefully at the front of the store to see if the creepy guy would appear. I watched as he looked up and down at the checkout, and when he didn't see me there, I saw him step outside. At this point, I quickly ran to the nearest open cashier, rang up all my items, and then stuck my head out the door to look for him. I didn't see him there immediately, so I started trying to make my way back to where I was parked. I had parked a little ways away near the side of the store where a bunch of other small stores and restaurants were lined up at, and I was walking towards my car. I realized then that I saw him standing by the entrance that I had first entered the store through, and then dug behind a pillar immediately, hoping he didn't see me. I watched carefully from behind the pillar, and as he scanned the parking lot, he obviously couldn't find me. After a minute or two, he started to walk out towards the direction of the parking lot in front of the store, and so I took that opportunity to make a run for it to my car as soon as that he was far enough away that I felt safe. As soon as I got into my car, I then locked the doors, and to my horror when I looked up, he was standing there about 15 feet from my car with a shopping cart in front of him. I knew that he followed me, and he knew that I knew. I fully believed that he had chased after me, and when I made it to my car, he grabbed the nearest cart to make it look like he was collecting them from the parking lot. I remember just feeling absolutely terrified at that moment. I went home and I immediately told my grandfather what had just happened. I began crying and shaking, and my grandfather told me to get in the car. We were going to settle this. He and I drove up to the store in his car, and he walked me into the store and demanded we spoke with the managers immediately, both of them. When the managers arrived at customer service, he asked me to tell them what had been happening and demanded that they ensure he left me alone or that he would involve the police. The managers swore up and down they would take care of it. As far as I know, he wasn't fired immediately because my friend who first encountered him with me when this whole thing began told me that she would see him from time to time when she was there by herself, but that any time I went with her, she would never see him. I fully believed that he knew whenever I was there, only this time instead of stalking me, he avoided me. Eventually, everyone who knew the situation stopped seeing him there, so I think he may have gotten fired or moved on from that store. Either way, I haven't had any issues since, but I've never in my life felt so afraid of another human being as I did that day, seeing him make eye contact with me in the parking lot as I locked my car doors. It still really creeps me out to think that he was watching me so closely every time I entered the store that he could so easily avoid or follow me whenever he wanted. So yeah, I was stalked every time I went grocery shopping for 4 months straight, and I never want to experience that ever again.
A couple of years ago, I responded to a Craigslist ad for a TV. I was in the market for a new one after mine broke, and unfortunately, I hadn't gotten the warranty for it. I searched on Craigslist because I figured that's where the best deals would be. People on Craigslist are generally just trying to get rid of stuff, and will sell it somewhere else if they want more money. That's what I was thinking, so after searching for a while, I found a TV that looked good. It was 55 inches, relatively new, and was a good price. Not so cheap that it looked like a scam, but cheap enough that it was a really good deal. I saw that it was a new listing, and I decided to contact the seller immediately so that nobody else would get it before I had a chance to. The seller responded to me rather quickly, and I asked to look at the TV. I had the money and was prepared to buy it as long as it worked and everything, but my main problem was how I would bring it back to my place. My car was really small, and there was no way I was going to fit it in there. My buddy Danny had a truck that it would fit in, so I texted him and asked him if he would help me out. Meanwhile, I was told that I would be able to see the TV that day at 3 p.m., and I agreed to go see it. My hope was that Danny would be able to possibly meet me there with his truck, but a few minutes later, he wasn't responding to my texts. I had to leave, and I drove to the location I was given to. It was about 15 minutes away from where I lived. I got to the neighborhood, which looked pretty average to me. It was a residential area that was a little bit out in the country, but not too much. Most houses were decently spread apart with larger yards and a decent amount of trees around. I arrived at the address and parked on the side of the street in front of it. It was a nice-looking house with a long driveway. They had some nice decorations outside and a garden in the front yard. I texted the seller letting him know that I was there, and he told me to come up to the front door. I got out of my car and walked up the driveway, then knocked on the front door. A man answered and said his name was Dave. Dave had gray hair and a gray goatee. He was maybe in his 50s or 60s. He told me he was selling the TV because his son gave him one, and he just wanted to get rid of this one now because he didn't need it. He then told me that he had some other people interested, so he hoped I would be able to buy it. After I saw the TV sitting in his living room and we turned it on, I told him yes, I would like to buy it, but I wouldn't be able to drive it to my place. I explained how I texted my friend, and then I checked to see if Danny had gotten back to me. He had, but he said he wouldn't be able to help me until tonight. I asked the man if there was any chance he would be able to hold the TV for me just until 8 p.m. when I would be back. I was surprised, but the man agreed, but he said he wouldn't hold it any longer. I left and went back home, and when Danny came by with his truck that night, I texted Dave, the seller, and he said it was fine for me to come and buy the TV now. Danny and I drove back to Dave's place, now at nighttime. When we arrived at the neighborhood and made our way to the address, I got confused. Dave's house looked different. All of the lights were off, the yard decorations were gone, and even the flowers were gone. It looked as though it was a completely different place than a few hours earlier. Danny shut his engine off and had already gotten out of the truck. I got out and told him to wait because it just didn't look right. Danny was confused and asked why as he began to walk up the driveway. I told him how it looked like nobody lived there now, and he did agree that it seemed creepy. I called Dave to let him know that I was there now, but after I called him, there was no answer. I texted him as well, but I couldn't get a response. We got back in the truck and sat in there waiting for about 15 minutes, but I didn't get any responses from Dave. I figured maybe he sold it to somebody else after all or something, and we decided we should just go back home. I was frustrated, and I was also really weirded out by the whole situation. That night, I was awoken in the middle of the night to my phone ringing. I picked it up and saw that Dave was calling me. It was almost 4 a.m. I decided to answer it because I was really curious why he was calling me now. When I picked up, I could hear Dave's voice start to speak, but I couldn't make out anything that he was saying. He then began to laugh like a maniac, and it really gave me the creeps. His laughing got louder and louder, and then he hung up. It took me a while to get back to sleep, but I was so creeped out by the whole situation that the next day I drove all the way back to the neighborhood. I knocked on Dave's door, but nobody answered. The house still looked abandoned, so I went to the neighbor across the street and knocked on his door and asked him if he knew the guy who lived there. He told me that nobody currently lived in that house and hadn't for a couple of weeks. After learning this, I went back to Craigslist and found that the listing had been deleted. I also looked at my phone and tried to call and text Dave again, but my number was now blocked.
Okay, so this might sound like a bit of a weird one, because not like a spooky story. Our Airbnb wasn't haunted or anything, and I don't believe in stuff like that to begin with. But when me and my girlfriend stayed at an Airbnb in Belgium, something happened that creeped us out so much that we had no choice but to leave the apartment and check into a hotel. I've had a mate of mine tell me I overreacted over this, but just put yourself in my shoes. First proper morning of our little weekend getaway to Bruges. Me and the old ball and chain are getting ready to go out for breakfast when we realized that neither of us had packed any toothpaste. It was one of those I figured you'd do it kind of things. But it was no big drama since we could just brush our teeth and help ourselves to sketchy mints the owners had left for us. But I do remember my girlfriend looking around in the bathroom just in case the owner had left us any and saying some throwaway thing like, "I wish they'd left us some toothpaste." Boring, I know, I'll get to the point. We go out for breakfast, have a wander around Bruges, grab some toothpaste, then head back to the Airbnb. That night, I go to take a shower before bed and saw that my girlfriend had picked up the weirdest toothpaste that I've ever come across in my entire life. Honest to God, it looked like something you'd get out of a Second World War ration pack with this eye-watering old-fashioned menthol smell to it. I have my shower, walk back into the bedroom where my girlfriend is half asleep, and I kinda poke fun at her for buying vintage toothpaste. She's knackered and half asleep, like, what are you on about? Telling me to shut up and go to sleep, etc., etc. I had a wee giggle to myself, then got into bed and tried to get some sleep. It was the weirdest thing because how did she not realize she picked up such weird old toothpaste? And that's when it hit me. She didn't. She didn't realize because she didn't buy it, which means someone else bought it and then put it in our room, which meant that someone was listening to my girlfriend when she was in the bathroom. And it's not like the place was small, and the bathroom was near the front door to the apartment or something. God forgive anyone who wake up my missus in the middle of the night, but I decided the circumstances warranted waking her up. She was annoyed at first, telling me to leave her alone, but once I explained the situation, she just sat up rigid in bed, like completely freaked out. We racked our brains as to how someone might have heard us, but couldn't come up with anything. Like I said, the place wasn't small and the walls were pretty thick. So how had someone heard us? The landlord lived miles away, and as far as we knew, no one else had keys. It's something that bothers me to this day, to be honest. But I still can't work out how someone heard us. And I did ask the landlord about it, who told me no one had been in the apartment. We were convinced it was him, though, enough to just pack our stuff and leave. I know he hadn't exactly brandished a knife at us or anything. What happened would most likely make for a terrible horror movie, but like I said before, put yourself in my shoes. Someone is listening to you when you go to the toilet, and for all you know, they're watching you too. And God knows why they're doing it, but it can't be a good wholesome reason. 1,000 nopes, seriously. Just thinking it over had me and my girlfriend getting out of there. It didn't ruin the trip too much. Like we realized early what was going on, so I think we got off quite lightly. The extra hotel money was the real scary part, though.
Okay, so I posted this on a sub before, and I was just thinking about creepy encounters I had. And it struck me that this one probably qualifies as kind of creepy. Hopefully I'm right. This happened about a year ago now. College student, and I was basically forced to move out on my own, which I didn't mind. That meant finding a new roommate, which can be daunting and a scary experience. I've had a few weird encounters, but I think this one takes the cake. I posted on Craigslist looking for a bedroom in a shared house or apartment for $300 or less. And on my ad I mentioned, please no phone calls, only text or email. Because I find being on the phone with someone I hadn't had a chance to size up a really uncomfortable situation. Just awkward, I guess. Anyway, I get a call from a dude who clearly didn't read the no calls part, which I mentioned because this type of phone call was exactly the reason I don't like to talk to strangers on the phone. At first he was just pleasant and normal. Told me he had a room available and relevant information like that. We start to talk about when and where we'd like to meet, and he started going on tangents about random things. A combination of interested and deep conversation, and too awkward to end a call when it starts to get kind of weird. So this call went on for 2 hours. Talked about the meaning of life and all kinds of weird shit. Honestly, this should have been the red flag. I shouldn't have met with him. Of course, I also should have grown a pair and told him I needed to leave. So, he wants me to meet him at his place and show me the room. Since learned that you should really insist on meeting in a public place first. I get to his neighborhood, and it was run down on a level that made the ghetto I grew up in look nice. Saggy front porches, hot cracked concrete, sad people with old beat up Lincolns. You get the picture. His house blended right in. The yard was seriously overgrown and the front door didn't work. So I went around the back and just looked at the guy standing in the doorway. Seeing the kitchen behind him was enough to make me realize that I really just wanted to leave. No way in hell. The guy in the doorway was a man with a sort of clown-style afro. He was leaning on a cane on his right side. His eyes looked crazy, and the house smelled musty from 10 feet away. Again, I'm a coward, so instead of trusting my gut, I go inside this house, and I'm polite, thinking, it's okay. It'll be over in 20 minutes, and then I can get the fuck out. I don't know what made me think this man, who had a 2-hour conversation with me on the phone about life and philosophy, would let me get away that easily. He took me up a flight of creaky steps into a small bedroom with no door and a mattress on the floor. I thought, no way in hell would I live with a 40-something-year-old man, and I was a 19 and a female, with no door on my bedroom. But it was a moot point because my mind was made up before I even saw the room. I wouldn't have lived there for free, let alone $200 a month. Things got weird. He tried to hold me hostage with conversation again. I think he was lonely. He talked about how some of his family were millionaires. He might have been delusional. The whole story seemed made up. He told me about an 18-year-old girl that has also checked out the room and tried to fuck him. And told me about how his mom hated white people. He was black and I was white. It sounded like he sympathized with her. Obviously, that made me even more uncomfortable. Eventually, I was able to find a break in the conversation, plucked up the courage to make up an excuse and leave. I was never so happy to leave a place in my life. I don't know that he was necessarily a rapist or anything like that, but he really gave me the fucking creeps.
A couple of years ago, I traveled to a city for a prospective job. I had a potential job offer and was going to stay a total of 2 days to look at the area in case I were to move there. I didn't really spend a whole lot of time looking for where to stay. I kind of just went onto the Airbnb app, found a place that looked good, and then went for it. I do remember, though, that the owner seemed like a really nice guy. When I arrived, the place itself was decent. It was a little place right by the city. I got the keys and got inside to drop off my stuff. After that, I went out for a few hours and then returned that night. I went to bed that night pretty early. I've always been kind of an early bird and I'm used to it. However, I woke up in seemingly the middle of the night, which is unusual. When I woke up, I looked around confused after seeing it was still dark outside and clearly nighttime. I looked at the clock to see that it was 2:30 a.m. and I remember, just as I was looking at the clock, I heard the sound of the front door to the house being opened. The house had been completely silent, and hearing that was a scary moment. I knew nobody else was supposed to be in the house. I'm not really sure what I was thinking. Maybe it was because I had just woken up and wasn't thinking clearly, but I grabbed the blankets and covered myself with them like a little kid. I then heard footsteps starting to come closer to the bedroom that I was in. My heart started to race like crazy, and I was terrified. I sort of came to my senses and knew that hiding under the covers was a bad idea, but what could I do? I had no time to prepare for this. As the footsteps got closer, it was clear to me that they would likely come in the bedroom. The only thing I thought to do was pretend to still be asleep. Maybe, just maybe, if somebody was going to rob the house or something like that, if they saw that I was fast asleep, they would just ignore me. I also felt this was my only option, because I had no time to run to the closet and hide, or grab something to use as a weapon. I didn't even have time to dial 911, as my phone was charging on the desk, not within my reach. Once whoever was there reached the door, I heard it open, and I closed my eyes and pretended to be sound asleep. I heard whoever was there take 2 steps inside the room or so, and then they just stopped. I didn't hear any more noises or movement for about a whole minute. Very carefully, I opened my eyes just a crack. I was careful to make it look like they were still closed, but I wanted to see whoever was in there. As soon as my eyes cracked open, I saw somebody standing right in front of the doorway, facing me. I looked at them for a couple of seconds. Then I recognized them. It was the man who owned the Airbnb. I remembered him from his picture. He was just standing there staring at me, with no expression on his face. I was careful to close my eyes without making it look like they had ever been open. I was terrified and also very confused as to what he was doing here. He stayed there for probably 5 more minutes and didn't move. It felt like forever, and I was just waiting for him to do something. Finally, I heard him turn around and then walk away. I laid in bed, listening carefully to wherever the man moved throughout the house. He went straight for the door and then just left. After that, I stayed up for about 2 more hours before I could get back to sleep. Luckily, the guy never returned. The next day, I contacted the owner of the Airbnb and asked him what he was doing in the house during the night. He denied being there completely. I reported him after that and did not return back. That was the last time I used Airbnb.
I used to work as an event coordinator at the Swan and Dolphin Resort / Convention Center. Sometimes we'd have to get there at really early hours of the day before the union laborers showed up. This was to get everything ready and set up for special events and stuff like that. One day, one of my managers had cut my hours due to a budget decline in the company. This resulted in me not making as much money as I used to, which caused me to fall behind on rent. Therefore, I had to start making some money until I could either get more hours or find a new job. Eventually, I began to sell some items on sites like Craigslist and eBay, which added to my income. It wasn't much, but it was enough to financially support myself through this time. At the time, I was in the process of selling a specific type of radio from the 40s that was worth a pretty penny. It was my grandpa's radio, and I guess it somehow got passed on to me after he died. I've gotten several offers for it, but the majority of them were people trying to lowball me for prices too small. At one point, however, I get a message from a guy who seemed really interested in it who was willing to offer me $500 for it, which was more than the listed price. I of course accepted the offer, and he then told me that he could come after 5 after he got off work. This was actually better for me, as I'd be out until 4. Anyway, 5 p.m. rolls around, and a few minutes after, I get a knock at the door and open it. Standing at my doorstep is an older-looking man, maybe late 50s, tall, with a long gray beard. To describe him a little better, he looked like a biker you'd commonly see in country movies. In a very deep and raspy voice, he says, "Hey there, I'm here for that radio?" I happily let him in and show him the radio sitting on the kitchen table, and even got him a snack. Oddly enough, he immediately begins inspecting the condition of it, and even went as far as checking the inside. After what felt like forever, he puts it down and says he'd do it for $300 as the condition wasn't the best. Needless to say, of course, that $500 deal was out the window. He then stares at me with this intimidating look where I felt like I didn't have a choice. In the end, I had to agree and did the deal with him right then. Mind you, I'm a petite 5'7" girl, so I wasn't going to try and argue with someone like him. He gives me the money, puts the radio in his car, thanks me, and drives off. I wasn't sure why, but something about him just gave off a negative vibe, which made me glad he was gone. The rest of the night was normal, where I had been watching a movie in my bed when my phone rang. The call was coming from an unknown number, but the area code was the same. Without thinking much of it, I pick up and immediately recognize the voice on the other end. It was the man from earlier calling me to thank me. What he said, however, will forever be burned into the back of my mind. "Hey Sally, look, thank you so much for your hospitality and kindness. If I'm being completely honest with you, I was planning to kill you with a knife I had in my back pocket the second I walked into your house. But you were just so kind, I just couldn't pull myself to do it. Take care now." Right then, my mouth draped open as humanly possible with all these thoughts racing through my mind. If I'm being honest with you, I wasn't sure what to do other than to process as to what I just heard. I would have called the police, but I later found out that the number he was using was fake from an app. That basically meant that even if police were to track the number, it wouldn't lead to him. After that, I removed the listing from Craigslist and never touched the site again. As scary as this was, I never received any updates on his identity or if he's in jail or not. There are seriously some crazy people out in the world who are willing to do anything to you. I emphasize that you please be careful when selling or buying something from sites like Craigslist. You never know who's out there and what they're capable of. This happened when I was in my mid-20s back in 2012 when I was living in Sarasota, Florida. I had just graduated from college and had gotten a job in IT as a software engineer at a really good company. Because of this job, I was able to move out of my parents' house and get an apartment. It wasn't big, but it was spacious enough where I could store most of my stuff. When moving out, odds are you'd probably have a few items left over that you no longer needed or wanted. Well, I had the same situation and had some things I didn't need that I put up for sale on Craigslist. At the time, Craigslist was booming in popularity where people were buying and selling left and right. One of the items I had listed was this large tote I had used back when I played sports. It was in pretty good condition, and I figured I'd snag a deal on it since sports were popular in my town. I'd say within a day, I had gotten a message from someone nearby interested in the tote. He seemed nice, didn't live too far, and was willing to pay more than what I was listing it for. Being so close to me, he'd offered to just meet me at my apartment, which would make for a smoother transaction. I'll be honest, I was a little uncomfortable, knowing that him, a complete stranger, would know where I lived. That being said, I brushed it off and told him I'd do it. Later that night, I hear a knock at the door and was greeted to a man who looked to be in his mid-30s with this Swedish accent. He immediately goes to hug me, telling me that it was a nice way of saying hello in Sweden. Being a gay guy, I didn't really mind it and thought it was a kind gesture. He hugs me for a good 10 seconds before letting go and asking me for the tote. I gladly give it to him, and he then proceeds to pull out a $100 bill and hands it to me, making sure our hands touched. It was a little uncomfortable, but I dismissed it as something people always did in Sweden. He thanks me, hugs me again, and walks down the hallway to the exit. Now let's fast forward till about 2 days later. I happened to be sick on this day and had called off work to rest. As I'm taking a nap in my room, I hear a heavy knocking on my door, which abruptly awoke me. I opened the door and was greeted to 2 police officers and the property manager. Confused, I asked what was going on, to which they then asked if I knew this person. The property manager showed me a photo of a man on his phone who just so happened to be the guy I had sold the tote to. I tell them yes and explained that I had sold him a bag, but that was all I ever knew about him. They take down my name, my description of him, and what he ever said to me or did to me. Whenever I asked why they needed that information, they informed me that they couldn't tell me as of now. That being said, they leave, and it wasn't until a few days later where I had finally gotten my answer. Turns out, the man I had sold the bag to had been wanted for owning 23 terabytes of CP. To put that in perspective, a single terabyte is equivalent to 1,000 gigabytes. This meant that he had about 13,000 hours of content downloaded. When I was told this, I was beyond disgusted, knowing I was talking to a predator, a wanted predator in my home. The tote I had sold him was to keep certain documents that contained information on how to cover his tracks. Obviously, this plan never went through, as he did end up getting caught in the end. I was interviewed for about a week by police before my complete shock slowly got back to normal. After that, I deleted my entire Craigslist account and decided to not sell anything else. Anyway, that's my story, and I hope you can take this as a learning opportunity to never trust people online.
This happened when I was 7 years old with my twin sister and mother. We had just entered our local grocery store, Surefine, when a man no more than 10 feet in front of us glanced over and immediately whipped his head back towards us. Now, as a quick side note, my twin and I at that age were always dressed in matching dresses, and we had long blonde hair that had always got us looks of awe and affection. But this was different. He was a bulky middle-aged man of mid-Eastern descent, and had stopped what he was doing to fully look at us up and down. A really husky smile crossed his scruffy face. My mother paid no mind to this, as she was no stranger to creepy men herself. I immediately grumbled to my twin Cass how creepy it was the way the man was looking at us. So as we turned left to start going through the aisles, Cass and I turned and we saw the man walking toward us with his shopping cart. When we first made eye contact, he immediately turned his attention to a table with baked goods on it, which kind of stood out to Cass and I more than if he had just kept walking normally. So my mother's obviously shopping, and Cass and I just keep glancing back, and we keep catching the man at the end of every aisle that we enter, just staring with no expression on his face, and even from a slight distance, he was seemingly breathing like really weirdly. I also noticed that his cart continues to remain empty, except for the baked goods that he grabbed when we had first looked back at him. We tell my mother, but she just rolls her eyes at us and tells us that he probably thinks we're following him because we keep looking at him. The man disappears as we hit the last of the aisles, and Cass and I are already on a completely different topic by now, when we're heading for the registers, having almost completely forgotten about him within minutes. We're about to make it to the register when my sister asks my mom for a candy bar, and I quickly join, to which she then angrily replies that we don't have the money for it. We're both pouting at this point, and she threatens to leave us as she begins putting things on the conveyor belt. But then Cass and I watch my mother turn to face us again, when her expression completely changes and her eyes shift behind us. It's the man. He's sweating profusely at this point, and he's literally less than like a foot behind us. Cass and I immediately take a step forward towards our mother. The man laughs awkwardly, then apologizes, saying,
"Sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to scare you girls. You're all just so beautiful. These girls, are they yours?"
My mother kind of scoffs to this and then goes, "Yeah, they're mine." And he does that same awkward laugh again, then saying,
"I couldn't help but notice that you don't have the money to get them what they want. How old are they, and you as well? I could help you. I have lots of money. Money's no problem for me."
My mother's face then furrows in confusion and annoyance, then snapping, excuse me?" Like clockwork, he laughs again like it's some big joke, then says,
"I'm serious, how much?"
My mother stares at him blankly for a moment, and he continues,
"How much for the girls? I'd like both of them, but if you could only part with one, I could still make that work. I'll give you the money. Just name your price, and I can give them anything they want. Any candy they want."
He grins yet again and wipes his brow, looking down at us. My mother doesn't respond to him, just looks at us and growls, "Here, now." So we do as we were told, which was fine by us because we didn't want to be anywhere near this creepy man. The cashier was a teenage girl no older than 17, and she was just completely wide-eyed watching this conversation occur as she silently continues to scan our groceries. Once we were next to my mother, she then growls at the man, "If you so much as lay one fucking finger on my kids, I'll break it off and shove it down your throat," which were some pretty big words coming from my 4'11" mother. But the man's face darkens, and without even purchasing anything, he walks around the cash register and exits, but he doesn't get far. The entire front of the store is glass, so moments later we watch as he presses his face against the glass trying to see in, leaving a sweaty face print behind. Now, at this point, the cashier's alerting her manager and asking him to call the police. My mother immediately assures them that that's not necessary, and just asks the manager to walk us out to her car. We see no sign of the man as we unload our groceries and hop into the car. My mother quickly drives us home once we sit in the car for a few minutes, scanning for any signs that he might be waiting in a car or something. We eventually made it home safely, and nothing ever came of it. I don't know what happened to the man, but I truly hope he never convinced anyone to give him their kid. That's absolutely horrific to think about.
Last year, I was invited to a wedding in Oregon. I wasn't from there, and I decided when I went there I could stay a few extra days and make it into a little vacation. I was interested in exploring the area nearby, and I was able to find a really good deal on an Airbnb only 15 minutes away from the wedding venue. The wedding was on Saturday, and I arrived at the Airbnb on Thursday afternoon. It was a smaller looking house in a nice little neighborhood, and I had the whole thing to myself. The first day, I went to a nearby city and met up with another friend I knew who was in town for the wedding as well. I returned to the house that night sort of late and tired from the long day. I got into bed, turned on the TV, and fell asleep within probably 15 minutes. I woke up the next morning without an alarm, which felt great, and I got up and made some coffee. When I was drinking it, I took a step out into the front yard because it looked like a really nice day outside. After I did, I was on the front step, and I noticed there seemed to be some sort of note taped to the front door. I picked it up and read it, not sure of what it could be. The note said, quote, "I broke into your house last night. You should fix your locks." And then they had written a little winking face on it. I freaked out when I read this and immediately went back inside the house and started looking around. I was sure the front door had been locked, because I remembered unlocking it to go outside just a few minutes ago. There was only one other entrance to the house, which was the back door. I ran over to it and checked, but that too seemed to be locked. I then started searching up and down the entire house, and like I said, it wasn't a very big house, so it didn't take me too long to look everywhere. After searching all the rooms, closets, and even cabinets, I didn't see anyone or a trace of anyone either. I was creeped out, but after time, thought maybe it was some kind of prank by somebody who lived on the street, and knew that this house was rented by people a lot. There was no way to know for sure though. I've always been a really deep sleeper, plus the house didn't have a whole lot of furniture in it, so if somebody had been here, I probably wouldn't have known. I left the house shortly after that to go do more stuff in the nearby city, and also see some local parks. I took all my valuable stuff with me just in case, and I also contacted the Airbnb owner about the note I received. I was hoping they would reply to me before I got back home, reassuring me that the locks were fine and it was probably just a prank. After another long day of trying local restaurants, visiting local parks, and other cool buildings, I once again returned to the house that night. When I looked, the Airbnb owner never replied to me, and I was a little bit scared to go to bed, but I was tired and was able to convince myself it was probably just a joke, seeing as though everything in the house seemed fine, and just as it was when I left it. Wedding was the next day, so I once again watched some TV and then drifted off to sleep at about 11:30. The next morning, I woke up without an alarm again, but this time I looked at the clock and saw that it was just after 6 a.m. I didn't need to wake up until 9 and was about to turn over and go back to bed, but just started feeling a little bit paranoid. I decided to get up and walk around the house to make sure everything was okay. As I left the bedroom and walked down the hall, I immediately noticed that the back door of the house was wide open. When I saw this, I wanted to get out of there immediately. I knew the back door had been closed and locked before I had went to bed. I ran into the bedroom, packed up everything I had in probably less than 5 minutes, and went to leave the house. As I was about to walk out the front door, I started to hear the closet door in the living room begin to open. I never turned around to look, and instead sprinted out of there to my car. I didn't see anybody exit the house, but I drove away and then contacted the owner of the house again, telling him what had happened. Then I contacted Airbnb customer support. For the rest of the trip, I stayed in a hotel. This story happened just last month. My wife and I were planning to take a little vacation just for the weekend. We found an Airbnb up in a really nice area with a lot of great land. The place was way up north, about 4 hours away. It was a house, sort of like a cabin, and was up on a hill with a really nice deck overlooking the massive amount of land nearby. The area was mostly woods, hills, and just land. We also really liked it because of how secluded it was from the rest of the houses. There weren't really any other buildings or houses in sight. In fact, most areas over there were just vacation homes or cabins. We drove up there early Friday morning and arrived to the property at about 10 a.m. When we got there, we had a great time just relaxing and enjoying the area. It didn't take long, though, before our trip took a turn for the worst. That night, as we were just sitting in the living room of the house watching a movie, all of a sudden we heard a knocking sound. I couldn't tell where it was coming from at first, but after pausing the movie and getting up, I could tell it was coming from one of the windows. I walked down a hallway to where the noise was coming from. As I got closer, I was able to locate the window, and then the knocking stopped. I reached the window where it was coming from, but I didn't see anything when I looked outside of it. However, I didn't have a good feeling about it, because the house was so secluded, and most parts of it were surrounded by trees and bushes. I knew anybody being around here at all would be suspicious. As I walked back to the living room, my wife asked me if I saw what was causing the knocking. Just as I was telling her about it, we then heard a loud pounding coming from the front door. It sounded as though somebody was trying to break the entire door down. I walked back over to the kitchen area to try and look out the window and see, but once again, when I got at an angle to actually see who was at the front door, the noises had stopped, and whoever was there was now gone. After this, we didn't hear any more noises for a while. I thought maybe whoever it was had now left, but about 30 minutes later, we heard the sound outside, just barely, of a man yelling. I couldn't tell what he was saying. In fact, I'm not sure if he was saying anything at all. We knew somebody was trying to mess with us, or get inside the house for some reason. We would hear noises or bangs against the house, but whenever we looked out the window, whoever was there somehow disappeared. This happened a couple of more times, and my wife and I were getting concerned. We didn't really feel comfortable going to bed with all this going on. It was getting late though, and I decided if we were in fact going to sleep there, I would go outside and take a look around. I went out the front door and took a walk all around the house, but saw nothing strange and didn't hear anything either. I hoped that meant whoever was there was now gone, and I went back inside. We decided we would go to bed, but if anything else happened at all, we would call the police immediately. Once we had both got to bed and turned out all the lights, almost right away, there was a sudden sound of glass breaking coming from the opposite end of the house. My wife grabbed her phone and started calling the police. I shut the door and locked it, and then started packing up all of our stuff. There was no chance I was going to continue to stay here with all of this going on. We didn't really hear any noises though as we waited for the police to arrive. It took them a while to reach the house with it being way out there, probably like 20 minutes. Thankfully, nobody tried to enter the bedroom we were in during that time. When the police arrived, my wife and I left the room with our bags packed. The police showed us a window in the living room of the house which had been broken, and there was some glass on the ground around it, but after searching the house, they didn't find anybody inside. I didn't feel safe though. After the police left, my wife and I did the same, and we checked into a hotel.
Back when I was about 4 or 5 years old, me and my mom went over to stay with my grandparents for the weekend. My dad left before I was even born, so it's always just been me and my mom, and my grandparents were always a huge part of my life growing up. We'd go over on a Friday night, then I'd stay till late on a Sunday, mainly so my mom could have a social life or work the long weekend shifts at her job. So this one dark Sunday evening around the holidays, I remember getting carried out to the car, like half asleep already, and then I don't even remember driving off because I must have been out like a light the moment I got strapped into the car seat. But then the next thing I remember, I feel the cold on my face, and I can hear my mom crying and begging someone not to hurt her because she had me in the car. I remember looking outside and seeing what I honestly thought was a monster at the time, but what I later learned was a man in a bunny mask. If you've ever seen that slasher movie, You're Next, it was kind of like the mask in that movie. Not some flimsy plastic thing. It was super detailed and really creepy looking. The guy's partner had basically stood in the middle of the road with his car at the side like he crashed it or something. Then when Mom pulled over to help, he puts on a ski mask, his partner appears with a bunny mask on, and then proceeds to rob us before doing something unspeakable to my mom. And it almost killed her. And I mean that both literally and metaphorically. She spent almost 2 weeks in the hospital, and I ended up living with my grandparents for almost a whole year because she was in and out of various institutions because it messed her up so bad. I hardly got away scot-free either, as I had nightmares about a bunny monster chasing my mom for literally years afterward, with that image being burned into my retina. But like with most things, time is the greatest healer, and as I hit double-digit ages, things eventually got better and we started to live something of a normal life again. Cut to me being 24, still living with my mom, but looking for an apartment to move into because I got a decent paying job with my college degree. The place came unfurnished, so I was looking for cheap furniture and decor for the place, and one of the first places I started looking was Craigslist. In the for sale section, I started seeing some pretty sweet looking items for sale at bargain bin prices, so I contacted one of the sellers and discovered that it was some guy's granddaughter selling off a bunch of his stuff to pay for a care home. The girl seemed really nice, and she even promised me some kind of discount if I bought a bunch of stuff in bulk, which suited me because I needed the stuff fast and I needed a lot of it. We arranged for me to go over to her grandpa's place to check some of the stuff out before I handed over the cash for them. So this one Saturday afternoon, I drove over to the house to start haggling. She introduced herself, was really sweet, but when I saw her grandpa, I realized why they needed the money for a care home. He was in a really, really bad way. I don't know exactly what was wrong with him because I didn't exactly ask any questions about his condition, but if you put a gun to my head, I'd have to say MS or something bad like that. He couldn't move from his wheelchair, he had an oxygen tank, he barely even reacted to his granddaughter introducing me, and he generally looked like he didn't have too many years left. I checked out the main 3 items on my list: a closet, a desk, and a dinner table, and me and the granddaughter agreed on a price for them. I obviously had to arrange a U-Haul to go pick them up and all that stuff, but I figured I could arrange for the following weekend once we'd confirmed the purchases. Once that was done, me and the granddaughter had some coffee together, and she explained that almost everything in the house was for sale. Apparently her grandpa had been something of a wild child in his youth, had been in and out of jail, and although he'd led a much more regular existence after his final stint in jail, he hadn't got a lot saved up for a rainy day. It was a real sad story, and the girl went on to explain that everything they'd piled into the garage was for sale too, and if I wanted to take a look around in there, I was more than welcome to. So, at this stage, I figured I'd just buy a few more things from them, maybe stuff they wouldn't be able to sell easily, knickknacks or whatever, so I could decorate my apartment while the money went to what I considered at the time to be a worthy cause. We finish up the coffee, the girl goes to help her grandpa out with something, and I head out to the garage to check out all the stuff that they piled in there. And boy, do I mean piled. There was a literal mountain of what they considered garbage in there, but some of the stuff I figured I could find a home for. I'm talking stuff like old cookie jars, books, weird little ornaments, all kinds of different things. I start digging through the pile of stuff, placing some of the items I'd considered buying to one side when, suddenly, I spotted something that had me frozen in place. What had obviously been bright white was now dirty gray-brown, and all the paint in the eyes and in the mouth was old and peeling. But slowly and surely I recognized what it was. It was something I'd seen in probably hundreds of nightmares I had as a kid. Something that had traumatized me and my mom for years and years and years. It was a bunny mask, of the exact same design as the one worn by the guy who'd almost taken my mom from me. I remember looking at it for a few seconds, then kind of stumbling back away from the trash pile in complete disbelief. I told myself that there's no way it was the exact same one. I mean, it looked like a mass-produced Easter bunny mask or something, definitely the same kind worn by that criminal, just not the exact same one. But then I started to piece it together, how Grandpa had been in and out of prison, and it all started to make a horrible kind of sense. I tried to pull myself together, and I think I did a good enough job of it to just bundle up what I'd pulled out from the trash pile before carrying it into the house to talk. I put on my fakest smile, paid for the stuff, then tried to make it sound as natural and innocently curious as possible when I asked the girl what her grandpa had gone to jail for. She was kind of taken aback and didn't know exactly. She just knew that he didn't talk much about it, and neither did her mom. So she figured whatever it was, it must have been something he was pretty ashamed of. I then asked if I could go into the room with the guy to thank him personally, insisting when the girl said he might not be able to really hear me, and if he did, he probably wouldn't respond in any way. I said it was okay, still maintaining my composure as I insisted on going into his room to thank him. The girl must have thought I was pretty weird by that point. Sweet maybe, but definitely kind of strange. Yet still, she let me go into her grandpa's room to thank him. I really did try my absolute best to maintain my composure, but by the time I got to the guy's bedroom door, my hand was shaking when I grabbed the handle to open it. When I walked in, there he was, sitting in his wheelchair, not even looking to see who walked into the room. His granddaughter had positioned him in front of a TV, but he wasn't really watching it. It looked like he was just kind of staring into space. I sat down on the bed near him, just kind of arranging my thoughts at first, and as I asked him my first question, I started to wonder, what in God's name was I thinking? I asked him something like, "Where were you living around in December of 1987? It didn't even get so much as a nod from him. He just kept this empty stare fixed on the wall in front of him. I actually wanted to just get up and leave, wondering if my questions would just end up confusing or upsetting a sick old man. But there was some part of me that just wouldn't let me leave without asking him the other questions. The scared little girl in me that wanted answers, who just didn't want to be scared anymore. I was hoping he'd say something, say anything to me about that mask I found in the garage. But as it turned out, I didn't need his words to know he could hear me. Then before I could even think to stop, I asked him, "Did you rob a woman with a kid in her car back around Christmas time of that year?" Nothing moved, but his eyes, which pitched up from the spot he was looking at as he began to stare at something else. But this time, it wasn't like he was just staring into oblivion. It was like he was thinking, remembering. I told him that his granddaughter had told me he'd been in and out of jail, and although he hadn't told me exactly what for, that I thought I knew what one of the sentences was for. He stayed quiet, but his jaw began to gently tremble, almost like he was trying to say something, but couldn't. What I said next was basically a lie. I didn't know it 100%, but when I told him, "I know it was you," his reaction confirmed it in my head. I know he was hardly capable of effectively communicating, but anyone else would have at least been indignant about the whole thing, maybe looked angry or confused. But even in his condition, he looked filled with regret. I saw tears welling up in his eyes as the frustration of not being able to talk began to overwhelm him. At least, that's what I figured his reaction was. I don't know if he wanted to tell me to go kick rocks or if he was sorry or what, but I didn't care for anything he had to say at that point. I just had one more thing to say to him before I got up and walked out. "You almost ruined my life. You don't deserve to be in that chair." He actually let out a kind of whimper as I stood up and walked out. And when the guy's granddaughter stopped me to say thank you, I disguised the emotion I was feeling by telling her that myself and her grandpa had shared quite an emotional exchange of gratitude, and that I was sorry if I agitated him. I guess she thought it was kind of sweet, and I honestly hope she never finds out the truth, but after getting back into my car, I only made it about 2 blocks before I pulled over and just started bawling. I was filled with doubt. Like, the thing that got me crying was the idea that I might have just seriously distressed a sick old man. But this other voice in my head just kept saying, "That was him. I know it was him. It had to be him." When I regained my composure, I drove over to my mom's place to tell her about it, and we both cried together when she said she also thought it was the same guy. I asked her if anyone was caught for what happened to us, and she said yes, that they were sent to jail as a result, and she had to appear in court to testify. That was part of the whole reason I was staying with my grandparents during that period. The whole court appearance thing just weighed so heavily on her mental health. I actually had no idea anyone was caught for it up until that moment. I was always under the impression that no one had been arrested, and I grew up knowing better than to bring it up with my mom. I mean, I still wouldn't have ever really spoken to her about it if it wasn't for that chance encounter, and part of me wondered if she'd even really believe me. It was only when I described what the guy looked like that it actually clicked for her, as at first she just refused to believe it. It seemed like the perfect karma for the guy. Like too perfect an end to a story, and I don't believe endings like that happen very often in life. In the months that followed, it felt like a great weight had been lifted from our shoulders. Nothing could ever change the past or undo the trauma we both experienced, but knowing the guy was suffering in such a way was almost like proof that there was a God. I know that might sound a little unhinged, but I can't really think of another way to phrase it. I guess I still don't quite believe in happy endings, and I still think the world is a cold, cruel place, but I know from experience that there is such a thing as divine justice. I'm from a city in the northwest of my country called Garanuns. It is a very beautiful place. Some call it the City of Flowers. I love Garanuns, but I cannot live there anymore. There are too many bad memories for me, and people accuse me of something which I am innocent of. You see, 8 years ago I lived next to a family called the Negromontes. They seemed like very nice people, but they did not have a lot of money since the man of the house, Jorge, could not find a job for some reason. It was spoken in our neighborhood that Jorge could not work because of an illness he had, but he had helped support his family by making and selling pastries to his neighbors, including myself. Jorge made the best empadas and salgados, which are traditional Brazilian pastries that we all love to eat, and on more than one occasion, I found him knocking at my door with a tray of delicious empadas for sale. They were very affordable and very delicious, and I know I am not the only one in our neighborhood who used to buy them very regularly from him. It felt good to be able to help him support his family like that. Some people said Jorge was mentally ill, but it seemed obviously to be that he had some kind of physical condition too. Sometimes, when Jorge called over at my apartment, he would burst out laughing for no reason at all, like he had heard someone tell a funny joke that only he could hear. Sometimes his arms seemed to shake when he held out the tray of empadas for me to look at, and one day he started having a nosebleed which dripped all over the pastries. He apologized a lot and seemed very nervous as he walked away from my door, but when I assured him it was okay and that I hoped that he would feel better soon, he broke into this high-pitched laughter as he disappeared around a corner. Jorge could act very strange like that, but I just felt sorry for him and kind of admired how determined he was to support his family like that by working hard at making delicious food. But one day, I came home from my job to see a few police cars outside the Negromonte house. All of the neighborhood had come out of their homes to see what was going on, and we were shocked when a forensics team showed up too. These are the police who wear the white overalls and masks, the ones who look for pieces of dead bodies when there had been a murder. There were many rumors about what the family had been doing, but we did not have to wait long to find out what was going on. The pictures were all over the newspapers one day, and everyone heard the story being told on the local radio and TV stations. Human remains had been found in the family's backyard, and they were identified as belonging to a local homeless girl named Jessica, who had gone missing some time before. The news reports told us that the Negromontes had apparently lured her into the house with lies that they were looking for a nanny to look after their young child, but had then killed her and buried it in the backyard. We were all shocked by the news, but as time went on, even more disturbing facts were made public regarding the murders. I remember the day that the police had a press conference with journalists from all over the country. They claimed to have found a 50-page book that had been written by Jorge that he had titled Revelations of a Schizophrenic. The book was all about how he claimed to have been hearing voices talking in his head about how he should kill women, how what he did was all part of some kind of terrible satanic purification ritual, and that he had a plan to purify the world and reduce its population. I found this to be extremely disturbing and upsetting, as I would never have imagined that Jorge could ever think like this. He always seemed like such a sweet person, but I guess I was wrong to think that. But somehow, as the weeks went by, we heard things that were somehow even worse, things that destroyed my life as I knew it. Forensics teams had analyzed the entire Negromonte house and discovered traces of the murdered woman's body tissue on cooking utensils used by the family. What's more, rather large chunks of flesh have been found to be missing from the bodies most recently buried in their backyard. Police could only come to one conclusion, that the family had been butchering the murdered women before cooking and eating their flesh. But what's more, rumors began to spread that not only had the family been practicing cannibalism, but they had actually sold some of the meat to the neighboring community in their empadas and salgados. It was horrifying to learn, as, of course, I had bought Jorge's pastries from him many times before, and not only had I eaten them, I thought they were very tasty. I remember sitting on my couch watching the TV when I heard the news. The room began to spin. I felt numb for a few moments, unable to properly compute the information that I had just heard, until it all became clear to me in one single horrible moment. I had eaten human flesh without my knowledge. I ran to the toilet and was violently sick. This was all traumatizing enough for me, but then rumors began to spread that the whole community was part of some satanic cult, and that we actually knew that we were eating it. People from all over the city came to our neighborhood to harass the people living there, including myself. Despite our denials, they called us all cannibals and told us that we were no longer welcome to live in Garununs. I personally had a note posted through my door from someone anonymous telling me that I would be killed in revenge if I did not leave the city. I didn't want to risk my life, so I left for the coastal city very far away from Garununs, where I currently live alone. I don't eat meat anymore. I am purely vegetarian because the taste of meat brings back horrible memories for me and makes me instantly sick every time I taste it. So, now you understand why I don't wish to give my name or give too much information as to where I live, as I'm afraid I'll be hunted by these people seeking vengeance for Jorge Negromonte's terrible crimes. But I swear to Jesus Christ I did not know what I was eating, and if I ever did, I would not have eaten it, and I would have reported Jorge to the police. So please, although you think you might know who your neighbors are, ask yourself, do I really know who I'm living next to? Do I really know what they're doing behind closed doors? Because for some of us, we don't know exactly who our neighbors are. Not until it's far too late. Okay, so I have something of a confession. I get totally out of control when I have a crush, and I suppose if you were to phrase it so insensitively, then I guess you could call me a stalker. It probably took way longer than it should for me to realize it too. Like I just figured I was, I don't know, intense, passionate, whatever you want to call it. When actually, what I feel for guys is, well, as my psychiatrist put it, it's unhealthy. Whenever I have a crush on a guy, it builds and builds until it's almost completely out of control. Sure, I get the usual stuff at first. Butterflies in my tummy, that giddy euphoria people feel when their crush is around. But I get other things too. Like, there's a lot more, and some things that people might consider kinda scary too. When I like a guy, they're constantly on my mind. They're usually the first thing I think about when I wake up in the morning, and usually the last thing I think about before I sleep too. I look up every social media account they have, and guys tend to be much less careful about their privacy settings, which makes that whole thing super easy. I make sure to see every single post, every comment, every friend, every photo they're in. I check their social media accounts usually more than 4 or 5 times a day. I also Google them online, hoping to stumble across anything new. For years I told myself that I just like knowing things about my crushes. Like, isn't that the point of loving someone? To know them as well as you know yourself? Well, again, according to my psychiatrist, not in quite the same way as I imagine. I track down where they live and spend way too long on Google Street View just admiring the place. I never go by or do anything though. I never want the crush to know how obsessed I really am. That would be absolutely mortifying. My psychiatrist says this is how I know what I'm doing is wrong and why he knew we could make progress if I put my mind to it. I also tend to get real jealous. I try not to show it, but I have to admit that seeing them having fun with anyone that isn't me, it really tears me up inside. I grow to hate their friends and family immensely, self-inserting myself into every little moment of their lives and telling myself, it better be with me, more fun, more special, more magical and memorable. How intensely I like someone tends to be based on how long I spend around them and in what context. Like the less I see them, the less I like them. The more I see them, it's like I'm exposed to something they're pumping out, like seeds taking root in my brain almost. A good example would be this. In 5th grade, I liked this guy. In 6th grade, the same guy, I became obsessed with him. Summer rolled around and I stopped. School started, I started liking him again. Repeat for 8th grade. Then he moved away for good and I stopped liking him for good. It was like I couldn't live without him for the longest time, but then, out of sight, out of mind too. I know that's not how other people function. Normal people miss someone no matter how far away they are, and no matter how long it's been since they saw them. Not me though, and I think that might be the only saving grace for some of these guys. I can't control my emotions even with the medication I'm given. It's one of the biggest challenges I face with my condition. If I didn't care so much about what I thought my crush thought of me, I would show up to his house and look in through the window, hoping to see him. I would pester all his friends to get every bit of info about him. I thank God sometimes that I've not gone too far, that I still have one foot grounded in reality even if the other is hovering over the abyss. Judging from what I've said so far, I'm guessing that most of you would assume me to be a violent person, like how a lot of those psychopaths and let's not meet stories end up being. But in fact, I'm the opposite of that. No one I know would ever think of me with such thoughts. I'm bubbly and kind towards those who are kind towards me. I never resort to physical confrontation. It's just not my personality. No one even has a clue how obsessive my thoughts get, and aside from this little confession, I tend to keep things that way. I hate how I get so attached to people, but as my psychiatrist says, at least you're self-aware. I've liked someone for 6 months currently, and I despise myself for it. I pretend not to be obsessed all the time and refrain from speaking about the person 24/7, even though I want to, because I don't want friends and, most importantly, my crush knowing about my condition. Like, I'm terrified I will ruin my life because people would judge me for it without getting to know me. I guess that's part of why I'm writing this too. Bottom line is, I need help on how to cope with these feelings if I can. I surprisingly let go very easily. You know that kid who moved in 8th grade, that I was obsessed with for like 3 years? When I found out he was moving, I was shocked and sad for about 15 minutes and then didn't really care. It was like whatever bug inside my brain just said, oh well, on to the next one I guess. So, my issue is just how to handle my feelings when I like someone. Keep in mind, this is just a light description of my issue. I felt a lot more than what I described here so far. I hope I get over my current crush over the summer and don't have any classes with him next year, since I would probably fall for him again. I rarely get crushes, but when I do, they better watch out. I've only had 4 crushes in total in my life so far, and 3 were part of my obsessions. Anyway, that's about it. I hope I could provide some insight into how female stalker types work, because all that yandere stuff is just a bunch of bull. That's like a guy's projection, the ignorance of thinking that guys and girls think or act similar, when honestly, the reality is much more insidious, and arguably, much more terrifying.
It was the summer of 2019, and we had planned a road trip from Texas to New York, as well as surrounding states. Our road trip was going well. We had ventured through some really amazing states and cities. The travel crew consisted of my husband, 2 daughters, my husband's parents, and myself. We're pretty self-conscious of the hotels we stay in, due to having 2 small children. Well, a review of La Quinta was really well in a suburb of Washington, D.C., and thus we chose to stay in that La Quinta. Once we arrived at that specific hotel, we had noticed that the hotel had a really rough surrounding area, despite the entire street being covered with hotels. Radisson, Marriott, True, La Quinta, Days Inn, etc., just to name a few. However, the shopping complexes and the restaurants near that area seemed rough. My family stayed in the car and I went inside the lobby to pay and check in. While I was walking up to the lobby, there was a lady who followed me from my car to the entrance and asked for money. From there on, many red flags were raised. Once I ran inside, I called my husband to drive the car around. We decided to just go ahead and stay, since it was just for one day. We ended up deciding to share a hotel room with my in-laws, as the area around seemed really shady, and I figured it wouldn't be a bad idea to keep some extra people around. Once we checked in, my husband and I went to go grab some pizza for the family. We brought some pizza and just chilled in the hotel room. Not a bad day or night. The next morning, we went to go grab the continental breakfast. After we had breakfast, I stayed downstairs by the car and started putting luggage in the car that was brought down by my husband and his dad. My mother-in-law was upstairs with my 6-month-old at the time, and my oldest, who was 3 at the time, was following my father-in-law and husband. Now, my husband and I always hold both of our kids' hands whenever we walk anywhere, and this wasn't different. My husband was holding her hand. My mother-in-law came down with my 6-month-old in hand, along with my husband and his dad, because they forgot something. We decided that my husband and I would stay down and load up the car. My mother-in-law would hold our youngest, and then my father-in-law would go upstairs with our oldest. So we had continued loading the car, as my husband's parents then went upstairs to make sure our luggage was down. Afterwards, my husband went upstairs to do a final sweep of the room. Suddenly, my husband then yelled that our oldest wasn't with them. I quickly shut the trunk of the car and went into flight mode. I started screaming her name and running around. My husband was now running around on the 2nd floor, knocking on neighbors' rooms, asking and checking. My husband's parents shut down and started crying. See, the hotel we were staying at was 3 floors. So as we're running around, I'm downstairs and my husband's on the 2nd floor, and my in-laws are standing by the stairs staring into space. We also had some pedestrians help us out and run and look around. The area had police and they heard me screaming, so the police had arrived within 1 minute because they heard me screaming for her. The officers also got her description and started asking for a picture. Finally, our oldest came down from the 3rd floor. We didn't check the 3rd floor because all of this happened within about 4 minutes, and we were looking around. We're really thankful we found her. We left that hotel, and now we don't go to any hotel that seems shady at all. We spend the extra money, and we just stay in a nice and secure hotel. We assume she went upstairs because we have stairs in our house, so she went up looking for her dad. However, there was a maid on the 3rd floor who was looking down at us. Her eyes were really emotionless and cold while we were looking. I called the hotel and asked for footage, but we never got anything. We decided to just let it go because our daughter was safe with us. This year, our oldest turned 6. We told her about the time that she got lost, and she actually remembered a couple of pieces about it. She told us that the maid had waved at her and went upstairs. Then she heard me scream her name. Parents, please be careful when you go on a vacation, especially if you bring your kids. My husband and I don't leave the kids' side anymore, and we aren't dependent on his parents.
Back when I was still a senior in high school, me and my mom went on a trip to the movies. It was this regular mother-daughter bonding ritual we used to have. Catch a movie, critique it, and then hit up the Bob Evans next door for dinner. We'd always pick up my dad something in a takeout box too, and I really miss those days. But anyway, we have our food and drive home, just like we always did, and the rest of the night was uneventful. But the next morning, I wake up to a Facebook friend request from a name I didn't recognize. Thinking it might have been a mutual, I just accepted, but then like 5 minutes later, I get a message from the same account that says something like, "Hey, I know this might sound a little weird, but I saw you at the Bob Evans last night and I wondered if you might like to go out sometime." So I'm like, how did someone figure out my name? Did they overhear my mom say it or something? Like, I get he was polite, but it still creeped me out. Why would you go to those lengths to find me? And he must have been looking for hours. Immediately, there's all these red flags, so I had no intention of accepting his invitation, but at the same time, I didn't want to be a jerk to him. So I messaged him back like, "Hi, yeah, I was there, but I'm actually kind of seeing someone right now, and I don't think they'd be too happy if we went out." At first, their reply was encouraging, and they seemed to take it on the chin. They say like, that sucks. Sorry if this is awkward now." I respond, "No, don't worry. You didn't know. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend, though." It was a close-ended reply, the kind that's designed to just end the conversation. Next thing, he starts typing, and I figured he's going to just carry on being gentlemanly, creepily direct, but gentlemanly, I suppose. But no. There's this very subtle shift in his tone when he says, "I just figured, since I went to all this effort to find you, you might give me a chance." This is where I saw a kind of, opportunity. I had literally zero clue how this guy had found me, and I didn't like the idea that just anyone could look me up online no matter how innocent their intentions were. So I straight up asked him, "How did you find me?" He starts typing, then stopping, typing, then stopping, and I can tell he's thinking of the right way to phrase it. Then he says something like, "Where there's a will, there's a way. I can find anyone online. It's easy. When I set my mind to something, I achieve it. Is your current boyfriend an overachiever like that?" I distinctly remember him using that term, overachiever, and was honestly so cringe. If I wasn't put off before, I certainly was then. But still, I wanted to find out how this creep had managed to track me down. So I might have done something stupid to get him to talk and said, "Honestly, no, and it's kind of hot that you're so smart and stuff. So how did you do it?" He responds, "I was the one who swiped your mom's card," he replied. So, a liar too. He wasn't some hacker. He just worked at the Bob Evans. So yeah, he probably had overheard my name, then just matched it up with the name on my mom's card. Then bingo, he finds me on Facebook. I had to hold back from just letting loose on this guy. But if he was that much of a psycho, then I figured it was better to not make him mad. "Ah, sneaky. I like it," I replied. "But like I said, kinda seeing someone right now, so thanks, but no thanks. Bye." I mute the conversation, but don't block the guy or unfriend him or anything. See, making him mad I was worried about. Then I just go about the rest of my day. Yeah, I told all my friends how creepy I was, and I casually suggested to my mom we pick a new food venue for our post-movie dinners, but other than that, I just went about my day as usual. It's kind of weird how this pattern repeated itself. The first time I'm asleep, blissfully ignorant that some creep is plugging my name into Facebook, probably to perv at my display picture. The second time I had him on mute, so I had no idea what was going on in that little message thread. It wasn't until later on that night that I opened my messenger on my phone and actually saw the little 44 notification count next to his name that I realized he'd sent me other messages. And yes, it did say 44. He'd sent 44 different messages, mostly rants, and he'd been sending them on and off all day. But it wasn't until I actually read what they said that I started to freak out. I'm not going to type up everything I remember him saying, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you will be able to guess the majority of it. Think nice guy style put-downs coupled with threats of actual violence. He basically said that if he'd managed to track me down online in a few hours, imagine what he could learn by the end of the week. He said he had friends that would help him break into our house. After that, they'd tie my parents up, kill them in front of me, then take turns abusing me until I was used up and lifeless. And that's the clean version of it, condensed into 2 sentences. 44 different lengthy messages he sent me. Think about that. The final message I read, it went on, before I ran downstairs to tell my mom and dad, was the message that read, "I'm in my car, and I'm looking for your house." I didn't know he was just trying to scare me, so I was crying as Dad called the cops. The guy ended up getting arrested for the threats he made, and I know he got fired from the Bob Evans because my mom kicked up a stink about it after the arrest. I never saw the guy again, so I'm thinking it was a case of his bark being louder than his bite. But I know that there are other women out there who aren't so lucky. and their stalkers are much more willing to get up close and personal. I just hope we can one day live in a world where men don't act all predatory and creepy with women they like it's so counterintuitive to what we want in a man. I wish they just understand that. But till then, I suppose all we can do is be safer online and with dating apps and hope we never run into that one sick psychopath that won't take no for an answer.